The hand in the futuristic glove clutched the pistol tightly. For all this was only for the defense and prosperity of their great empire. The two soldiers fiercely shot back at the enemies, realizing that for the sake of the emperor and his people, any threat had to be destroyed. Surrounded by energy spikes, the armored fighter accepted his fate, for this he believed was his sole purpose for existence. A helmet with brightly burning red visors hid the face of a dedicated Imperial Guard fighter, fully prepared to follow any order. The young fighter with a robotic arm mercilessly shot enemies without showing an ounce of doubt or sparing anyone in his path. On future Earth, where technology has reached incredible heights, there was little hope due to endless war and a severe lack of resources. As a consequence of this devastating conflict, humanity was forced to leave its homeworld and seek salvation on other distant planets. Life on the once flourishing Earth has come to a tragic end. The planet has been destroyed by an invasion of ruthless alien beings. However, the surviving part of humanity did not give up and continued to scour the vast expanse of space, looking for a new home among the stars. Finally, after many years of grueling wanderings, they found a planet remarkably similar to Earth and named it Novus, meaning new home. The golden symbol of the Balato Federation shone proudly over their new territory, which had become a free haven for humans and other friendly species. The bright pink symbol of the mighty empire of Akritia towered over their technological city, ruled by a disciplined army of robotic soldiers. The mysterious turquoise symbol of the Sacred Alliance of Korra represented a faithful nation that possessed tremendous energy and indestructible mental fortitude. But the resources of Novus, unfortunately, were also not unlimited, and humanity again began to prepare for the inevitable war for their monopolization. In the face of the impending new war for precious resources, the lone armored fighter stood unwavering, his eyes burning with cold determination. In the sterile machine lab of the Akritia Empire, the newly arrived fighter was told that he was out of luck and would be compared to everyone else. The stern commander of the Imperial Guard of Akritia, Hamilus Castoria, reminded the young man that he was to show His Majesty all that he was capable of. A cocky Akritia Imperial Guard trainee named Luca smugly replied that they'd see who was really unlucky yet. Hamilus, recognizing the trainee's name, warned Luca that he had better live up to the high expectations placed on him, to which Luca briefly agreed. Luca was concentrating on thinking that he should at least block or masterfully dodge all the bullets, for that was a necessary skill for an Imperial. He was proud to realize that he had gone through all the simulation training and was a trainee with a deep sense and enhanced perception of space. A group of armed opponents suddenly appeared in front of him, clearly ready for an immediate and violent clash. His opponents were only 5 suicide bombers, clad in cheap and primitive cybernetic equipment. He coolly assessed the situation, realizing that this uncomplicated confrontation shouldn't have taken him too long. He assumed with absolute certainty that he could deal with them in no more than 10 seconds, and rushed to the attack. In the thick of the fierce battle, he moved with incredible speed, deftly dodging enemy attacks and striking back with precision. Luke was well aware that this was an excellent opportunity to make a lasting impression on the Emperor himself, and he was obliged to distinguish himself. He was feverishly pondering how exactly he should have acted in order to not just win, but to stand out as much as possible. Although he had never tried anything like this before, he felt an inner conviction that he simply had to meet this challenge. He made a firm decision that he needed to crank his senses and perceptions to the absolute maximum to show the unbelievable. A powerful aura of energy instantly erupted around him as he began to reflect a barrage of enemy shots with astonishing agility. Wounded, breathing heavily, but unbroken victor, he realized with satisfaction that he had indeed done it. He had surpassed himself. He was absolutely certain that such an outstanding and impressive result would undoubtedly increase his value in the eyes of the commanding officers. The commander remarked in surprise that he had not expected Luke's masterful use of projectile trajectory control, because it was not in the program. Luca modestly replied that he had simply copied what he saw from the one in front of him, and the commander thought of the apparent superiority of the nobles. Commander Hamilus suddenly put his hand on his shoulder, saying that he liked Luca and wanted to give him a special gift. Hamilus pierced his arm with a spike without warning, noting with satisfaction that Luca didn't even flinch, and praised his stamina. The commander clearly enjoyed such incredible resilience, and Luca, despite the oozing blood and pain, replied that he was only glad he did. The fighter standing next to him cynically remarked that he would have removed his eye anyway, just to get an implant with the coveted trajectory prediction function. With a confident and slightly arrogant smile, a new challenger, who introduced himself as number 12 by the name of Eli, entered the room. The mysterious voice said it would like to speak to him. Number 32, Luca, making him wary of the unexpected address. The suddenly appearing Elias apologized, asking if he had been too harsh, catching Luca unawares in his private room without warning. Luca, a little surprised but collected, gestured for Elias to enter, and he quietly proceeded into his humble abode. Eli smilingly expressed his sincere admiration for Luca's amazing performance, but the latter coldly replied that he wasn't in the mood to exchange pleasantries. Eli Karthika appeared to be a member of the noble aristocrats, and from his aura alone, it was quite obvious to Luca. Luca logically reasoned that it was extremely disadvantageous for him to impertinence such a high-ranking person, referring to his extreme fatigue. Elijah held something out to Luca with an understanding smile, telling him to just take it, for that was the purpose he had come for. In his robotic hand, Eli held a small blue pill, explaining that it would help dull the senses and rest better. Luca refused to help at first, but Eli persisted, convincing him that without proper rest, tomorrow's training would be ineffective. Elijah assured him that his remedy was different from the street sleeping pills, and Luca retorted by noting that Elijah was great too, and he was just copying him. Elias modestly mentioned his mechanical battle eyes that made it easier to miscalculate trajectories, but emphasized that Luca's work on instincts was far more impressive. He assumed that was why the commander had noticed Luca, a regular guy, and had even given him a mechanical eye at his expense, to which Luca replied that he'd just been practicing a lot. Luca wondered with bitter irony how he, a weak commoner, could compete with the magnificent and all-powerful aristocrats. He remembered his difficult past, when he, being at the bottom of the hierarchy, had to cling desperately to any slightest chance of survival. Eli countered that even though Luca had passed the selection process fairly, quite a few of the nobles had failed it, and he was betting that they would just pay their way through the results. Although there was no direct evidence, Eli was sure that guys like Luca, without support, would never fail the procedures, because they were making their way on their own. Luca was extremely surprised, not expecting such revelations about the imperfections of the nobility from the nobleman, and wondered what he wanted to tell him. Elijah looked at Luca seriously as he held out his hand, and said that he truly believed that only people like him were worthy of the true summit. He added that he was genuinely rooting for Luca, looking at him with obvious support and expecting a reciprocal gesture of confidence. Luca hesitated for only a moment and shook Eli's outstretched hand firmly, answering firmly that he wanted it too, cementing their unexpected union. For all this, he firmly believed, was done solely for the prosperity and unbreakable might of his great and ruthless empire. This incredible story was meant to tell the hard events in the life of a young boy who was raised from childhood as a soulless military tool. All of these harsh trials took place in the cruel and oppressive empire of Acretia, where human life had negligible value. The planet Novus, so similar to ancient Earth, was divided between three powerful forces: the Bellotto Federation, the Acretia Empire, and the Korra Alliance. At the shooting range, Luca and Elias stood silently at their firing ranges, preparing for another grueling practice or important test. Luca discharged his weapon with incredible focus and icy calm, striking his targets with startling and terrifying accuracy. He coolly inspected the dummy he had riddled, satisfied with the results of his perfect shooting, showing no emotion. Eli was genuinely amazed, exclaiming that Luca was able to hit all the dummies exactly in the head, noting that the honors students were indeed of a different dough. Elijah wondered curiously if Luca had already gotten used to his new right eye and didn't think it was unfair to shoot so well while specializing in close combat. Luca nonchalantly replied that a member of the guard simply had to be good with any kind of weapon, and added that there was something else important. He remarked with a slight chuckle that he would not wish to hear such reproaches from one who himself had shot after shot at precisely the same point. Elijah warned with a smile that if Luca continued to be so carefree, he would surely outdo him, for he was genuinely rooting for him. Eli added seriously that their great empire desperately needed just such outstanding and dedicated fighters as the determined Luca. He bitterly noted that the value of true skills and talent was slowly eroding in their empire, where status and money decided almost everything. But Eli hoped that if naturally gifted commoners like Luca started to make themselves known, people would finally see the difference. Luca sternly warned Elias that his words sounded like a dangerous criticism of the foundations of the empire, and that denunciation could have serious consequences. Elias only smiled good-naturedly, certain that Luca was not capable of such an act, for he knew he was a good man. Luca, slightly irritated by such self-assurance, mentally scowled, though Elias thanked him for his earlier concern and understanding. 2 long years later, in the harsh conditions of the 3rd Training Corps, armored vehicles moved leisurely along the dusty road to the training ground. The stern commander announced that Luca and Eli would be leading their own combat squads of recruits in today's large-scale training. The commander sternly warned that if any of the recruits had a problem with this decision, they could leave the room immediately. Eli said with a confident smile that since there were no objections, they would proceed according to his carefully laid out plan. They were told that the Corinthians had illegally settled in this remote ravine, and this training would test their skills in the field. With a fierce gleam in his eyes, the commander gave the ruthless order that no prisoners were to be taken. It was necessary to simply kill every last one of them. Eli noticed that this was their first real assignment and asked Luca if he was nervous, since he'd had a chance to kill people in training before. But this time they were facing an outside military force, and Eli reminded them that all factions, including their empire, were descended from Earthlings. Luca coldly advised Elias not to indulge in empty emotions, for it could hinder them in their important and dangerous task. He wondered with slight irony if Eli thought the senior guardsmen were here solely for their protection and cover. A formidable all-mechanical legion loomed before them, ready for any surprise and capable of crushing any resistance. Luke explained that they were wardens who wouldn't hesitate to kill them if they tried to save someone's life, and he was fine with that. He added stiffly that the rest of Novus were just annoying bugs to the Empire, and they had been taught that every single one of them wanted to cheat them. Eli barely squeezed out that he knew this, for it was exactly what they had been so diligently and methodically taught from their earliest childhood. Luca, clad in his black armor, stepped resolutely through the burning ruins, noticing that the Corinthians didn't even seem to be armed. He was confident that this simple task was going to end without any unforeseen accidents or serious complications. Suddenly he stopped, seeing a small figure huddled in a corner amidst the blazing chaos, shrinking with fear and despair. A small child, covering his face with his hands, cried quietly and called for his mother, his thin voice barely breaking through the roar of the flames. Luca froze, his face contorted with surprise and confusion, as he saw a defenseless child in the midst of all this horror and destruction. The child was so badly frightened that he couldn't even move, numb with fear and unaware of what was happening around him. Luca instantly assessed the situation. There was a non-combatant unit in front of him that was clearly not going to offer any resistance if he had a gun. The commander's ruthless order sounded in his head again. Take no prisoners, kill them all, leaving no one alive. He mentally ordered himself not to hesitate, for these were just pests who were brazenly and ruthlessly eating up the precious supplies of his great empire. Gathering all his will into a fist, he drew his sword for the fatal blow, ready to ruthlessly cut short an innocent life to fulfill an order. Tears rolled down the face of the small child, who stared in horror at the approaching death, unable to make a single sound. At the last moment, Luca lowered his sword and quietly advised the child to play dead to have any chance of surviving this bloody chaos. He thought uneasily that he shouldn't have done that, because if the general staff found out about his actions, anything could happen to him. For a moment, he pondered whether to go back and finish the child, to cover the traces of his momentary display of unacceptable weakness. Suddenly, a powerful explosion went off very close by, causing him to turn around sharply and try to figure out what had happened in this blazing inferno. He was surprised to see Eli standing on top of the nearest tower, and couldn't figure out what he was doing there at such a dangerous moment. Eli was calmly aiming his rifle, his face completely unfazed, as if he was completely oblivious to the flames raging around him. Luca went cold with horror, realizing that Elias had most likely seen everything, and now his secret was out in front of a ruthless witness. He tried to reassure himself by assuming that Elie would not report what had happened, but he was plagued by doubt and fear of the unknown. Suddenly, he noticed a flash of energy above Eli's head and realized that he needed to keep a close eye on his unpredictable comrade. Another deafening explosion shook the tower where Elias was, and Luca rushed anxiously to his aid, fearing the worst. He shouted Eli's name desperately, peering into the puffs of smoke and flame, hoping to see that his comrade was all right. A mighty warrior emerged from the fire and smoke and fiercely ordered the Accretians to get away from his land immediately. Luca was stunned to realize that it was this mysterious stranger who had most likely set off that powerful and devastating explosion. He anxiously thought that if this warrior was capable of causing explosions without any weapons, then he possessed incredible and dangerous power. Suddenly, a small observer drone swiftly attacked the warrior, but the warrior easily threw it away with a powerful energy pulse. The warrior focused his power again, and the ground beneath Luca's feet trembled with the incredible power emanating from this mysterious creature. Luca realized with horror and admiration at the same time that what stood before him was not just a warrior, but a real force-wielding, incredibly powerful opponent. The warrior shouted furiously that this was not a military base, but a simple, peaceful settlement, and they ruthlessly killed people who were just trying to survive. He bitterly wondered if the captain knew about it, and if he had told them the truth right away. Perhaps Eli would still be alive. Elias, badly wounded, whispered to Luca that he had been careless and had no excuse, but Luca only replied to rest and he would take care of the warrior. Luca bitterly realized that all of this was due to his momentary hesitation, for he had been instructed many times on how to handle such. He decided that he would personally take care of this warrior and ordered everyone else to spread out and return to their military base immediately. The enraged warrior shouted disdainfully after them. Where were they going, these miserable and despicable bastards, not daring to look him in the eye? Luca surmised that the warrior seemed to have taken the role of bait, so that his few allies could safely escape from pursuit. He remembered that in order to use the power, a person had to perform a certain sequence of actions, and in this warrior's case, it was hand signs. As long as he could see those distinctive rifts in space arising from the warrior's strength, he could successfully resist his devastating blasts. Luca knew he would have preferred a grueling battle of attrition, but he had no choice, even if his body would suffer from the maneuvers. He was obliged to attack the warrior immediately while he had the chance, and rushed towards his target with incredible speed. Like lightning, he dashed through the barrage of energy discharges, closing the distance between himself and the unsuspecting enemy. He was absolutely sure that his enemy would not escape now, and prepared to deliver a decisive and fatal blow with his sharp sword. The warrior turned around in surprise, not expecting such a swift and bold attack from a seemingly ordinary Imperial soldier. Only Luca's destroyed helmet flashed before his eyes, and he realized with horror that this was likely his imminent death. Bleeding, he whispered bewilderedly that Luca was just a child, unable to believe what had happened to him. Luca mercilessly pierced the warrior's body with his sword, not showing an ounce of doubt or compassion for his defeated foe. He struggled to pull the sword from the body of the warrior, who hung lifelessly from his blade, and breathing heavily, looked at his bloody work. Exhausted, he stood over the defeated enemy, surrounded by raging flames and destruction, realizing the cost of his hard-won victory. He was relieved to think that if the warrior had continued his furious onslaught, he would surely have died in this brutal and unequal fight. He couldn't understand why the Koratovian, a fanatic with beliefs beyond comprehension, couldn't kill him when he had the opportunity. An internal order to move sounded in his head. For during battle, one could not let emotions completely consume oneself and cloud one's mind. He reminded himself that all of this was done solely for the sake of his great and indestructible empire, and any sacrifices were justified for that purpose. For the sake of the emperor and his people, it was necessary to ruthlessly destroy any, even the most minor, threat to their well-being and prosperity. That, he firmly believed, was the one true purpose of every Imperial Guard fighter's existence, and he shouldn't want anything more. In the recovery pod chamber of the Akricha Healing Hospital, he and Eli were recovering from a hard and bloody battle with an unknown enemy. Eli grinned and asked Luca how he liked the feeling of being on the edge between life and death. But he only stared at the ceiling in silence. Luca coldly replied to let Elias speak for himself, for he was the one who had almost died there, to which Elias only laughed, not taking his words seriously. Elijah reported that he would have new arms and legs, and Luke talked about his injured back and ordering titanium bones and artificial skin. Eli asked thoughtfully if the commander knew that the power wielder would be there, for that was very important information for their survival. Luke assumed that the commander hadn't said anything to them because he wanted to test them, and since the wardens hadn't intervened, they could handle it. Eli noticed that it was strange how he and the other cadet who'd had their heads blown off by force had somehow miraculously managed to survive that meat grinder. He even suggested that maybe the mysterious man didn't want to kill them at all, but was pursuing some goals of his own, unknown to them. Luca remembered the words of the defeated warrior that he was just a child, but firmly replied that he was already a warrior, a soldier of his empire. He thought scornfully that it was a worthless mercy, the reason the Corinthians continued to die out, and advised the warrior to regret it in hell. Elias suddenly asked Luca why he had turned a blind eye to that child of the Corinthians, catching him off guard with that direct and uncomfortable question. He pressed for an answer, simply asking Luca to tell him why he did so without taking his piercing gaze off his face. Luca, irritated by his chatter, rudely interrupted Elias, sarcastically asking if he had renewed his tongue along with the rest of his body. He replied briefly that it was an unfortunate misunderstanding that would never happen again, making it clear that the conversation was over. The stern instructor announced that they had completed 2 years of their 4 years of training, and a new batch of cadets had arrived, for whom they would be a model. The instructor especially singled out 2 of them, Luca and Eli, calling them his top 1 and top 2 among all the cadets who had successfully completed the training. He confidently stated that they could very well even become centurions, and encouraged them to continue to work hard for the empire and its citizens. Eli answered enthusiastically, "Yes, sir." And Luke mentally repeated the word centurion, realizing the importance of this high and honorable title. The Imperial Guard was organized quite simply. 1,000 guardsmen divided into 10 hundreds, each commanded by its own centurion. The instructor announced that that was the end of it and ordered them to continue training, reminding them that cadets like Luca were appointed centurions after replacing their bodies with mechanical ones. Luca thought with determination that if he could become a centurion of the 10th hundred, he would definitely be able to achieve a great deal in his hard life. In the training arena, Luca and Elias faced off in a fierce fight, their movements fast and precise, each eager to gain the upper hand over their opponent. During the intense battle, Elias managed to land a painful blow on Luca, forcing him to retreat and regroup for the next attack. Their fight was so intense that they were literally flying around the arena, exchanging lightning-fast punches and blocks, showing off their skills. Luca noted with dismay that Elias was noticeably stronger and more dangerous with his new arm than before, and he would have to do his best to win. Gathering all his rage and strength, Luca rushed to the attack, his eyes burning with determination. He was ready to do anything to defeat his rival friend. After 124 grueling rounds in which he had won 124 victories, Elias stood over the defeated Luca, breathing heavily. Luca thought with annoyance that he had so hoped to win at least this time, but Elias countered that there would be no point in practicing then. Elijah noticed that Luca seemed to have gotten even tougher after that instructor's speech, and those centurions seemed to be firmly planted in his mind, to which Luca agreed. Luca explained that if he succeeded in the Imperial Guard, he would be in demand everywhere, but Elias countered that he had already reached the heights. He replied bitterly that unlike Eli, he had nowhere to go back to, and so he had to climb as hard as he could. Luca noticed that Elias was also talented, but he clearly lacked motivation, and asked why he had joined the service in the first place. Eli admitted with a smile that he had always wanted to be a scientist, an archaeologist, and dreamed of studying ancient, long-forgotten civilizations. Luca wondered why he didn't go there if he wanted to so badly. But Elias explained that archaeology was forbidden in their empire and his family wouldn't allow it. Luca scornfully called Eli spoiled, reminding him that in the slums, people dreamed of just getting through another day and were happy for any food. Elias calmly replied that he knew Luke would say that, but he was just sharing an intimate thing with a friend, because it could be interpreted as criticism. He added confidently that Luca would not do so, for he too kept his secret, hinting at their shared knowledge of the spared child. Luca admitted that he hesitated because the enemy was unarmed, but even if Elias hadn't intervened, he would still have brought the matter to an end. He declared with burning eyes that he was loyal to the Emperor and the Empire for discerning his talent, and the enemies of the Empire were his enemies. He looked coldly at Eli, adding that he was no exception, and if he stood in the way of the Empire, he would suffer the same fate. Eli jumped off the wall and grinningly called Luca a liar, not believing a word he said about his boundless loyalty and willingness to kill. He noted with a sneer that if Luca's loyalty to the Empire was indeed beyond ordinary loyalty, he would have tried to kill him by now. Elijah smilingly advised Luca not to exert himself so much, for he was well aware of his friend's true feelings and inner struggles. Luca muttered moron in annoyance, realizing that Elias saw right through him and warned him that he would die if he kept this up. Their third-year reconnaissance mission took them to an uninhabited neutral land dotted with mysterious ancient monoliths. Eli touched one of the monoliths with admiration, calling the place mysterious and full of unsolved secrets of long-ago eras. He was surprised to note that the monolith responded with a burst of energy even after millions of years, testament to the incredible power of ancient technology. Eli asked Luca excitedly, "Wasn't that amazing? After all, there were civilizations that explored the stars before the dawn of mankind." Luca mentally noted that he had set boundaries before, but Elias continued to stomp on them, ignoring his warnings. He sternly reminded Eli not to relax, after all. They were on a reconnaissance mission. This was training, and if they came across anyone, there would be a fight. Eli waved it off nonchalantly, saying that the wardens would help them anyway in case of emergency, not giving any thought to the possible danger. Luca said wistfully that the present existed because of the past, and these ancient footprints would give them a glimpse into the distant future. A young cadet named Cloud Ramones remarked that if you thought along these lines, you could see why people were so interested in history. Another cadet whispered to Luca that Cloud's family might not be as prominent as Karthika's, but was still highly respected, and asked permission to inquire about something. He suddenly asked Luca if he was seeing anyone, adding that he liked him, to which Luca vehemently ordered him not to make another move. Cloud suggested to Luca, if he had no partner, to introduce him to his younger sister, for Luca, though a penniless orphan, held an honorable position. Elijah grinned at Luca's popularity, and Cloud urged him to just think about it since his sister was very pretty, to which Luca only growled for him to shut up. The commander had given orders that Luca's group would provide cover from the rear, and the biological response indicated the enemy was approaching, and he and Cloud would remain on the front lines. Suddenly, Luca sensed that something was rapidly approaching them from the depths of the ancient ruins, and he was seized with a bad feeling. A powerful paladin of the Corinthians emerged from the shining portal, clad in gleaming armor, his appearance inspiring both awe and mortal terror. The paladin clenched his energy weapon, his blade glowing with a bright blue flame, ready to rain down on unsuspecting enemies at any moment. Luke shouted in terror to his companions to flee immediately, realizing that they could not cope with such a powerful and dangerous foe. The paladin released a powerful energy discharge that easily pierced several cadets, leaving them no chance of escape. Luca was horrified to see Cloud, struck down by the paladin's attack, fall lifelessly to the ground, and his heart clenched with despair and hopelessness. The image of a smiling Cloud offering to introduce him to his sister surfaced in his mind, and the thought hurt him even more. He realized with horror that he had only managed to see a brief glimpse of the spear, and that the upper part of poor Cloud's body had already vanished without a trace. His mechanical eye began to malfunction, producing one error after another, and he ordered it to work in desperation, for his life depended on it. He frantically tried to force his eye to calculate the trajectory of the paladin's deadly spear, but the system kept producing errors, not giving him the information he needed. His comrades shouted to Luke to pull himself together, seeing his confusion and fear in the face of a superior enemy in strength and skill. Elias fiercely ordered him not to stand pillar to post, but to fight and buy the time needed for reinforcements to arrive or to organize a retreat. Luca thought bitterly that Elias was right, and even if he tried to escape, he still wouldn't get out of here alive without help. He realized that there was only one way to solve this desperate situation: fight to the last man until Imperial Guard reinforcements arrived here. He only needed to hold on for about 20 seconds to give his comrades and himself a chance of escape from imminent doom. He was quite sure that the warden from the guard would soon come to the rescue, for they could not leave their cadets to be torn to pieces by the enemy. Looking at the timer showing 17 seconds and 22 hundredths, Luca prepared himself for his last and most desperate battle for survival. The paladin was preparing his energy spear for another attack with frightening calm, the timer on his arm counting down the last moments before the strike. Luca looked desperately at the approaching spearhead, realizing that he could not dodge it, and he was gripped by a chilling fear of impending doom. Those seemingly short 20 seconds stretched into an eternity for him as he desperately tried to fend off the paladin's deadly blow. The word death flashed through his mind, and he thought with horror that there was no way he could survive this fight with the monster, these damned 20 seconds. Suddenly, a stern-looking warder appeared beside him and called out to him roughly, noting that he looked like a piglet realizing that he had been led to slaughter. The overseer shouted furiously that if one turned his back to the enemy, all that awaited him was a bullet in the head. And while the enemy was swinging his sword, one should do the same. He growled angrily that there was no place for weaklings in the Imperial Guard, and his words echoed in Luca's head, making him grit his teeth. The timer showed 3 seconds, and Luca, gathering his last strength, decided to attack first before the paladin could make his deadly lunge. He lunged forward, his body enveloped in red flames of rage, and he unleashed a barrage of blows at the paladin, desperately trying to break through his defenses. 4 seconds and 36 hundredths had passed, and Elias and his comrades watched in horror as Lucas single-handedly held off the onslaught of the mighty paladin. 5 seconds and 27 hundredths later, Luca, wounded and exhausted, was still on his feet, his breathing heavy and his gaze full of determination. 6 seconds and 11 hundredths, he realized bitterly that he could no longer use his damaged arm, but it was still possible to block the spear with it. 7 seconds and 51 hundredths, he gritted his teeth, realizing that he had to prepare for the paladin's next attack, which could be his last. The paladin unleashed another barrage of energy discharges at him, but Luca, despite the pain and fatigue, continued to desperately dodge and defend himself. 9 seconds and 1/10, he was fending off attacks with his last strength. His body was at its limit, but he wasn't going to give up without a fight. Suddenly, the paladin changed the direction of his attack and rushed towards Elias, and Luca cried out in horror as he realized that he wasn't the target. 11 seconds and 53 hundredths, the paladin was rapidly approaching Eli, who was completely unprepared for this turn of events. 12 seconds and 9/10, Luca's eyes were bloodshot with rage and desperation. He couldn't let the paladin get to his friend. With a furious roar, he lunged towards the paladin, ready to sacrifice himself to save Eli from imminent doom, the time on the timer frozen at 12 seconds and 44 hundredths. He pushed himself off the ground with incredible force, his body enveloped in flames, and he rushed towards the paladin like a fiery meteor ready for the final blow. With a furious roar, Luca came crashing down on the paladin, his blow so hard that the ground beneath them shuddered from the incredible power of the collision. He managed to intercept the paladin's spear, his robotic arms struggling to contain the colossal energy of the enemy weapon ready to explode. With an incredible effort, Luca threw the paladin back, his own body enveloped in flames from overexertion, but he was ready to continue the fight. A powerful explosion lit up the battlefield as Luke released his stored energy towards the ancient monolith, hoping to divert the paladin's attention. He turned around and saw the monolith begin to glow brightly, and at that moment, a giant battle robot emerged from it, ready for battle. The huge robot, named Legion, towered over the battlefield, its eyes burning red fire and thick smoke from overheating coming from its hull. Luca cried out in relief that he was saved, seeing the mighty Legion engage the paladin, giving him a chance at survival. The Legion blocked the path of a paladin who was trying to break through to Luke, and the two mighty warriors met in a deadly battle not for life but for death. The paladin attacked Legion with fury, his energy blade leaving deep furrows in the giant robot's armor, but he did not retreat. Luke watched the battle between the two titans with admiration and fear, realizing that it was a battle of a whole other level, unavailable to him. The Imperial Guardsmen bearing the weapons of the Empire, the Legion, and the Holy Knight of Kor using the Force converged in an epic battle for the fate of this place. Luca watched the duel with bated breath, wondering which of these mighty warriors would be the stronger in this ruthless battle. Their blows were so fast and powerful that the ground shook and the air was filled with the crackle of energy discharges and the scraping of metal against metal. Their clashes sent debris of trees and rocks flying through the forest, and the ancient monolith was covered in cracks from the incredible force of their attacks. Legion and Paladin exchanged blows with such speed that the human eye could barely keep track of their movements. It was a battle of the gods. Luca was horrified to think that they were so fast that even with his eyes he couldn't keep track of their weapons. This was Imperial Guard-level combat. He mentally prayed that the guardsmen would win, for not only his life depended on it, but the fate of their entire scouting mission. The Paladin, wounded but not broken, tried to deliver a decisive blow to the Legion with his last strength, but the latter deftly dodged and counterattacked. A thought flashed through Luca's mind for a second as he saw the Legion begin to prepare their most powerful attack yet, capable of destroying everything around them. He realized that the Imperial Guardsman had no idea of the speed and power of the spear he had felt on his skin, and would hardly be able to react correctly. He cursed in horror, realizing that if the Guardsmen died, they would all die with him, for they could not handle the Paladin alone. He decided that something urgent had to be done, and he rushed towards the scene of the fight with incredible speed, desperately trying to change the course of the battle. The Paladin's energy spear slammed into the ground with tremendous force, nearly hitting Legion, who struggled to stay on his feet from the power of the blow. Luca, caught between Legion and the Paladin, desperately tried to dodge the deadly beam of energy released from the Paladin's spear. He mentally prayed that the Paladin had missed, for another such accurate strike could be the last one for him and the Legion in this battle. With an incredible effort, Luca managed to intercept the Paladin's energy spear, his hands trembling with exertion and his eyes burning with rage and despair. The Paladin, not expecting such resistance, tried to wrench his weapon away, but Luca held him firmly, not giving him a chance. Gathering the last of his strength, Luke aimed the Paladin's spear at his chest, and a powerful blast of energy threw both warriors apart. Wounded and exhausted, Luke lay unconscious on the ground, his body covered in wounds and his armor badly damaged from the brutal battle. He struggled to open his eyes, not realizing what had happened or which of them had survived this deadly battle. His mind clouded with pain and fatigue. He thought bitterly. Surely the Knight of Korra had survived and everything else was gone. His hopes of victory dashed in an instant. He saw Legion's figure leaning over him and whispered, "Please," out of the last of his strength, not knowing what exactly he was begging for in this desperate moment. Legion calmly said that it was a good job, cadet, and his words sounded to Luca like the best praise of his hard life. Legion reported that he had been able to overpower that knight thanks to Luke, and asked if he had been wounded in the stomach, for he had been wounded dodging a blow. He reached out to Luca and told him to go back to base, for his mission here was over and he deserved a rest. Legion was the all-mechanical armor that the Empire provided to its guards. It replaced all vulnerable body parts, allowing a person to become a weapon. Every cadet dreamed of getting the Legion, for it was evidence that he was a full and valuable guard of the great empire. Luca looked at Legion in surprise, not believing his ears when he asked if they were alive even without a brain. His words sounded strange. He wondered perplexedly if Legion was even human or just a soulless machine, not understanding how the man could say such things. Legion, standing over the defeated Luca, said, "My brain," thoughtfully, and Luca wondered with horror if he had lost it completely. Luca chided himself in frustration as he looked at Legion's lifeless body and his own, wounded and helpless, in the middle of the hostile forest. He wondered with horror if he had been striving all this time to become like the soulless and ruthless monster that the Legion seemed to him. He was cold, his body wouldn't stop shaking from pain and blood loss, and he wondered with desperation if he could wait for help. He bitterly realized that this was likely to be the last sight in his short and full of danger life, and resigned himself to his fate. Suddenly he heard a familiar voice ask if he was still alive, and with difficulty he turned his head to see his savior. He was incredibly relieved to see Eli, who, though not in the best of shape, had still survived the bloody and brutal fight. Elie sadly reported that everyone but the two of them had died in the battle with the paladin, and now they were all alone in this hostile place. Luca asked how serious Eli's wounds were, and the man, leaning over him, feebly replied that he was near death. Eli asked what Luca planned to do next, but he only looked at him incomprehensibly, not knowing what to say to such a question. Eli advised him to look, for what he had longed for all his life was right under his nose. All he had to do was reach out his hand. He pointed to the lands of the Kor and Balato alliance visible in the distance, saying that this was what Luca desired, but what he could not have in the Empire. Luca replied, enduring the pain, that he was fine, and advised Eli to leave if he wanted to, for he himself no longer cared. He reminded them that reinforcements would be arriving soon, and if they crossed paths, all that was left was to return to the Empire, so Eli should have left. Luca said that Eli had a family noble and wealthy enough to support him in any times of need, and any citizen of the Empire would be bound to see that. He added bitterly that he could not understand Eli, for he had no one to support or protect him in this cruel world. Elijah noticed with a smile that Luca shone brighter when he talked about his dreams, and it was visible even through his stern mask. So he wished with all his heart for Luca to live the life he wanted, to follow his dreams and ignore difficulties and obstacles. Luca wondered what Elias was doing calling him a fool when he tried to pick him up in his arms to carry him off the battlefield. Eli replied with tears in his eyes that judging by Luca's behavior, he was really going to the other side of the world, and he couldn't let that happen. He declared with determination that he would not be able to live peacefully if he just left Luca to die alone in this hostile and deserted place. Luca muttered frustratedly, "What a dumbass," as he watched Elias take him on his back and rush away from the damn place. Luca, clad in his new cybernetic body, sat alone and thoughtfully reviewed a catalog of cybernetic modifications for fighters. Elias suddenly appeared and asked with a chuckle if he was looking for new parts, catching Luca off guard with his sudden appearance. Eli suggested recommending the F-24 Reuse model, assuring that with its short adaptive period, Luca would get back on track faster, and it was better than the current one. Luca irritatedly asked Elias when he would stop appearing out of nowhere, to which Elias apologized with a smile, asking if he scared him. After returning to the Empire and recuperating, Luca was summoned to another department for a thorough and detailed interrogation about what had happened. They wanted to know what had happened there, that 3 cadets and an Imperial Guard warden had died without a trace on that mission. The incident was officially dubbed Clash with the Paladin of Korra, and Luca first thought that he had been summoned to investigate the matter in depth. Elias said that he had heard that some ancient artifact had been found where they were being sent, and now everyone was arguing over who should get it. Luca thought with annoyance that he knew it. This mysterious hovering cube was the reason for everything, and asked who had finally cleaned it up. Elie reported that they have reassigned a team specifically equipped for research purposes to study the artifact they found. He added anxiously that if the Sacred Alliance refused to give up the place and the artifact, a great and bloody war would surely break out. If the Empire declares war on the Alliance, Bellato will be at an advantage just watching them internecine strife and weaken each other. Luca indifferently remarked that he had little interest in the political question. He only cared about direct orders and the upcoming battles for the Empire. Eli noted with satisfaction that this was what a true, loyal, and ruthless member of the Great Imperial Guard was supposed to be like. When Luca reported that the decapitated member of the Guard continued to move, the captain concluded that it was a phantom phenomenon caused by residual signals. Luca doubted if it was just a residual signal. After all, Legion was consciously reacting to his words already after his actual death. It wasn't a phantom. He sat alone, immersed in his thoughts, realizing that he had so many questions that he couldn't find answers to. But he also realized that he wasn't stupid enough to try to make sense of something that the very top of the Empire itself refused to answer. There was one place in the vastness of the training grounds that didn't quite fit the general atmosphere of the harsh and ruthless Imperial Guard. It was a guest room specifically designed for family and cadet-friendly gatherings where they could relax and unwind a bit. He thought sadly that, as an orphan, he had never yet been here, in this place meant for meeting loved ones. So he didn't even expect anyone to want to meet him, as he had no family or friends outside of the Guard. Lillian Ramones was sitting in front of him, and he couldn't understand why Cloud's sister had come to see him. Her visit was a complete surprise to him. He thought anxiously, just as long as she didn't start asking about Cloud's death, because he had been the leader of that ill-fated squad. Lillian calmly replied that if he thought as if she had come to express her hatred, he needn't have worried. Her intentions were different. She stated firmly that she had come to see him, Luca, and sat down at the table, waiting for him to be ready to hear her proposal. Lillian said that her brother talked about him a lot, calling him the most talented friend among the other cadets, and asked if she wanted to meet him. She recognized that it was her initiative, and even though Luca was an orphan and she knew of his background, it didn't matter to her. Luca was surprised to notice that she looked like she was interested in having a relationship with him, and this puzzled and confused him greatly. Lillian asked with a smile if he was against it, but Luca replied that he didn't know her at all, to which she offered to remedy that by asking why him. She said with confidence that he would benefit from it, for many guys were jealous of him, and her brother's dying request was a good reason. Luca agreed that there was absolutely no reason to refuse her, because to get such a golden bride of noble blood was a 1 in a million chance. He had always strived for success in this life, and marrying an aristocrat would only bring him closer to his cherished goal. What more could one wish for? Nevertheless, he felt that it was all somehow too easy, and he was tormented by vague doubts and suspicions about it. That's why he had his doubts. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more than mere sympathy behind the proposal. After a short thought, he stated emphatically that he had been forced to refuse her offer, much to Lillian's surprise and consternation. He said a brief goodbye and made to leave, leaving Lillian utterly bewildered and confused at his sudden and abrupt refusal. He thought Eli, who had everything, was an idiot for dreaming of getting out of the Empire, but he himself was just as stupid. Luca was sure Lillian would take his refusal as an insult to an aristocrat, and hoped it wouldn't spill over into something serious for him. Suddenly he felt a powerful jolt, and Lillian, seized with rage, rushed swiftly at him, her eyes burning with anger and resentment. Lillian embarrassedly said that it must have been too much of an event for him, and offered just friendship for starters, holding out her hands to him. Luca replied with a confused look that wasn't the case at all, not sure how to react to her sudden and insistent suggestion. Lillian glared at her and promised to come back, and Luca only muttered, "See you later," still in a mild state of shock. He looked at his robotic arms in bewilderment, not believing what was happening. His thoughts were confused and his heart was pounding with excitement. As she left, Lillian tossed over her shoulder that she probably wouldn't be easy to get rid of, and her words made Luca think about the future. At the sparring training ground in Acretia, Luca stood waiting for his next opponent, ready for any challenge. The combat instructor in the Imperial Guard, Kinuan, remarked with a chuckle that he didn't think Luca would come to him for help or advice. Luca replied that he had come to learn from the instructor, for in everything that concerned wrestling, he always asked for help, although he knew how to do a lot of things himself. He thought defiantly that since there were those stronger than him, it wasn't enough that he was considered the best cadet on the course. Instructor Kinuan, though powerful, was not as despotic as the other instructors, and Luca knew and appreciated that very well. Unlike the others, he was using a rather mediocre combat enhancement that was 10 times weaker than what Luca wore. Luca realized that the only thing he was losing to his instructor was that he didn't have his entire body stitched together, so he was trivially weaker. But he was sure that if he couldn't win even against him, he wouldn't stand a chance against someone like Paladin Korra. The instructor replied with a sigh that he didn't have much choice, and briefly ordered Luca to attack, ready for the upcoming fight. Luca lashed out with fury. His fist was racked with energy. He unleashed a flurry of blows at the instructor, testing his reaction and defense. The instructor easily repelled his attack and asked with a chuckle if Luca wanted to try out his new, recently obtained equipment. Luca thought that the instructor might have been a retired guardsman, but he was sure that he wouldn't even flinch from such an attack. He unleashed a hail of lightning-fast blows on the instructor. His movements were quick and precise, but he easily dodged them. Luca decided to just jump on him, shortening the distance to deny the instructor room to maneuver and take him by surprise. He was confident that he would finish the fight with one quick and accurate blow and victory would be his eyes burning with determination and excitement. Suddenly, Luca felt his body surge into the air, thrown back by an unknown force, and he couldn't understand what was happening. He wondered why he was flying, for he was sure his attack was going to reach its target and bring him victory. He shouted angrily that the hell it would stop him and tried to regain his balance in flight to continue the fight. With an incredible effort, he braced himself and prepared for another attack. His eyes burning with determination, he wasn't going to give up so easily. But an unknown force threw him back again, and he flew backward with great speed, unable to resist this powerful impulse. He looked down at his hands in bewilderment, trying to figure out what the hell was going on because he hadn't felt any impact. The instructor noted with a chuckle that Luca not only misjudged his opponent, but also allowed himself to be distracted during the bout. He asked Luca with slight irony why he was so impatient. After all, it was just a training session and not a real fight. Luca struggled to his feet. His head was buzzing and he couldn't understand what had happened, for he thought he would hit Kinuan with his first attack. However, as he realized, as soon as the instructor merely touched his arm, his body deflected as if he had completely lost control of it. Or to be more precise, the kinetic energy he had communicated to Kinuan was redirected back, shaking him himself with incredible force. The instructor calmly explained that this was his personal and very effective method of self-defense that he had honed through years of training. Luca asked hopefully if the instructor could teach him the technique, because he really wanted to get stronger and learn new skills. The instructor asked with a sly smile if Luca still wanted to learn, and the look he gave him made him a little nervous and wary. He added meaningfully that a shortcut always had its price, and a heart-shaped drop of blood appeared on the floor. The instructor asked Luca what he had learned from this short but instructive bout, and Luca admitted that he felt enchanted. The instructor explained that it was Victim's Arcane, or the arcane fighting style, a very ancient and effective method of combat almost forgotten. Luca doubtfully noticed that it was similar to what the bandits usually used, but what he saw was so impressive. The instructor agreed that they were considering it, but the Victim Arcane had 3 significant flaws, and Luca suggested that it was hard for him to learn. Luca asked what else, and the instructor mentioned with a serious look the possible side effects of a severe concussion. The instructor added that there was something else that Luca was unlikely to understand right now, but he replied firmly that if he got stronger, the risks were justified. The instructor sternly objected that it wasn't for Luca to decide. After all, he was already a valuable asset to the Empire, and a lot of money was invested in him. He demanded that Luca answer him, and the latter, clenching his teeth, threw himself into another attack with fury, unwilling to give up his purpose. The instructor warned that training in the arcane fighting style would inevitably leave repercussions in Luca's brain, and asked if he could swear to stop. Luca realized that the instructor would understand even if he lied, his penetrating gaze leaving no doubt about that unpleasant fact. He answered honestly that he couldn't swear to it, but he would try not to use this dangerous style without extreme necessity and need. The instructor liked this honesty and put his hand on Luca's shoulder with a smile, expressing his approval of his forthrightness and courage. He advised Luca to always expect an attack from him from now on, because that way he would always be ready for any unforeseen and dangerous situation. Luca rephrased the "say" with surprise and joy, unable to believe his happiness that the instructor had agreed to teach him the style after all. The instructor told him to get up with a smile, adding that he liked those who were quick learners, and Luca was just such a capable student. Elijah wondered if Luca had slept at all lately, noticing his tired and haggard appearance after his long training. Luca replied that he was just very busy, for he had been practicing with Kinuan every day for a month now, honing his fighting skills. He explained that if someone didn't understand at a glance, nothing would change, even if it was explained to them in words, because Kinuan hadn't taught him anything. Arcee's fighting style was very different from anything Luke had been trained in before. Most of the techniques were based on memorization and honing. It was some sort of supreme combat algorithm that used the entire arsenal of techniques to deliver the most effective counter in a matter of seconds. Luca asked Eli how his mission went, and he said it was boring. He was told to get rid of the malfunctioning android, which wasn't hard. He added that all the current missions were like that, just child's play. Apparently the Korra Alliance was being cautious because of the last incident. Elie disagreed, saying he'd heard from those close to him as if the chief centurion himself was stepping in. A rebellion was planned, no less. He admitted that he didn't know the details, but there was definitely a group of conspirators, and this was very disturbing and dangerous news for the Empire. Luca thought with annoyance that there was already a war coming with the Alliance, and some assholes were planning a civil war, calling them retards. Eli noticed with a chuckle that if Luca was writing off all his internal problems as idiocy, then he was part of the problem himself. Suddenly, Luca gave Eli a hard blow, throwing him back several meters, his eyes burning with rage at the words and accusations he heard. He angrily warned Eli that he could turn a blind eye to the fact that he wanted to leave the Empire. But if he was plotting to become an enemy, he would not let it go. Elias, rising with difficulty, replied that he too had passed the Imperial Guard aptitude test, and such remarks were of no importance to the Empire. He calmly advised Luca to calm down. His voice was even. Despite the blow he had received, he was trying to diffuse the heated situation. Elijah asked Luca to stop jumping to conclusions that could be misunderstood, adding that he wouldn't want to see his name on a list of traitors. He smilingly suggested that Luca relax and treat him to something tasty for the weekend, trying to ease the tension that had arisen. Luca replied coldly that he had already made plans, and added that he was sick of Eli's chatter, and that he was sick of his speeches. Eli asked curiously if Luca had gotten a girlfriend since he had plans, and reminded him that it was past time for him to leave himself. In the lower sector of Akricha, amidst the dismal slums, Luca and instructor Kinuan walked through the dirty streets, remembering the past and pondering the future. Luca thought with disgust. When he became a cadet, he thought he would never go down to this lower sector again. He didn't want to breathe that air. He didn't think Kinuan would drag him here when he announced the plans, and rudely shouted at some types to get out of the way, for they were blocking the passage. The air of the lower sector was heavily polluted, the city was powered by the thermal energy of the magma, and all the waste and excess went to the lower sector. The instructor beckoned Luca to follow him, and the latter, after a little hesitation, followed him deep into the gloomy and dangerous slums of the lower sector. Luca asked in surprise if this was the black market, to which Kinuan replied that curious kids rarely got out of here alive. He figured instructor Kinuan was pretty knowledgeable when it came to the lower sector, which was funny since he was an Imperial Guard himself. The instructor had told him to use simpler prosthetic arms and legs on this hike, and Luca couldn't figure out what the man was up to this time. Kinuan earnestly told Luca to get ready, and the man looked at him bewildered, not understanding what exactly he was supposed to be ready for. They were stopped by two thugs, saying that the spectator entrance was that way, but Kinuan replied that he wanted to talk to the owner of the establishment. The guard asked in surprise if they knew Aleph's boss, to which Kinuan replied that he didn't really, but he just really wanted to see him. The guard shouted furiously if Kinuan was crazy and pointed his huge gun at him, not expecting such a defiant response from the visitor. Kinuan dodged the shot with incredible speed, and with one precise leg kick knocked out the insolent guard without giving him a second thought. Luca, using his skills, instantly disarmed the second guard, ordering him not to move, and the latter froze in place with fright. Instructor Kinuan asked with a smile if they had figured it out now and asked for a quick call to Aleph, their main boss and the owner of this place. Luca asked what Kinuan would do if he didn't make it in time, to which he calmly replied that he would look for another way, obviously. He asked the instructor curiously what this place was, and the instructor, pointing to a huge structure in the center of the hall, prepared to answer. Kinuan replied with an enigmatic smile that it was the hottest spot in the entire empire, and Luca couldn't understand what he meant. He said one word with a chuckle, "Colosseum," and the name echoed in Luca's head, causing both awe and curiosity. In the dimly lit room, they met Aleph, who sat in a chair surrounded by his loyal bodyguards, ready for any orders. With an indifferent look, Aleph ordered Kinuan to release this boy into the arena, showing not a shred of sympathy or interest in his fate. Kinuan replied that no fee was needed, and if Luca died, there would be no claim against Aleph, and Luca realized why he had been forced to wear weak prosthetics. Aleph forcefully put out his cigar on the table, his face contorted with anger. He clearly hadn't expected such a response from his old acquaintance. Luca seized the moment and delivered a hard punch to Aleph's jaw, knocking him back a few meters, his eyes burning with rage and determination. Aleph's bodyguards reacted instantly, pointing their weapons at Luca and Kinuan, ready to fire at the first order. One of them remarked with a chuckle that they seemed to be confused about something, for they had not been let in to fulfill their requests. But here it was more convenient to dispose of the corpses. Luca realized that it was a bluff, because if they wanted to kill them, they would have already started shooting without wasting time on idle talk. He quickly assessed the situation. The three were aiming at him, their guns ready to fire, and any mistake could cost him his life. Behind the door, he assumed, were two more with guns, ready to come to the aid of their comrades if necessary. He decided that the first thing he had to do was to do something to change the course of events and get some chance of survival. Suddenly, he activated his ability and a green glow enveloped him. He used Eli as a human shield, covering himself with it from shots. With incredible speed, Luca disarmed the two bodyguards, their bodies flying aside from the powerful blows, their weapons clinking uselessly against the floor. He kicked in the door and neutralized two more guards before they could react, his movements quick and precise like a predator. Like a ghost, he swept past the stunned bodyguards, leaving them no chance to resist. His attack was flawless. Suddenly, everything around them froze, and Kinuan calmly said that the simulation had been completed, and Luca wondered where the previous manager had gone. Kinuan replied with a chuckle that the man was dead, having been caught rigging the results, and added that it looked like Kinuan had taken out Toru and taken his place. He explained that he and Tora were friends, but he didn't hold a grudge against him after all. The latter had also killed the previous manager to get here. It was the order of the day in the slums. Aleph angrily asked who Kinuan was and what he knew and pointed his gun at him, his face contorted with anger and suspicion. Kinuan calmly advised Aleph to calm down if he didn't want to follow Tora, and his cold tone made Aleph lower his weapon. Aleph chided himself with annoyance, realizing that he was in a lose-lose situation, and now he would have to reckon with this brash and dangerous stranger. He asked irritably if he should let this brat out into the arena, his voice full of contempt and displeasure at the situation. He added that Luca didn't even have prosthetics. He was just ordinary meat that would be rolled up in the arena without a chance. Kinuan replied that he could let him out, but definitely not for a simple thank you, and added that he knew where Tora had hidden his safe, and he had his eye now. Aleph asked suspiciously how Kinuan knew all this, and added that he was insanely curious as to who he really was. Kinuan replied with an enigmatic smile that he was a relic of the past that Aleph was better off not knowing about, and his words only increased suspicion. He offered Aleph to watch the fight. They had VIP seats, booze and girls, and advised him not to judge the boy by his looks, but to find him a serious opponent. Luca thought that Kinuan had a lot to learn. He controlled the situation and overpowered the enemy by his mere presence. He had the right qualities. In the locker room of the arena, Luca was preparing for the upcoming fight. His thoughts were focused on winning. He couldn't afford to lose. A voice from the speaker announced that the fight would take place in 2 hours, and advised him to stretch well before entering the Colosseum arena. Luca asked Kinuan what was in that safe that Aleph was so quick to change from anger to mercy, and he replied that there were riches in there that could change his life. Kinuan noticed with a chuckle that Luca was interested and suggested he win the fight, and then he would tell him everything. That was his reward. Kinuan showed Luca a picture of his opponent, Gabriel nicknamed Iron Fist, and the latter scrutinized his future opponent. Luca thought with disdain that the arena was full of idiots willing to jeopardize their health for the sake of illegal modifications, and his opponent was one of those. Kinuan told Luca to memorize what he was about to say, for it was the basis of Akias's fighting style, and Luca interjected basis in surprise. He explained that the main principle of this style was to adapt to what you have by utilizing your strengths. Luca countered that he had been taught that to adapt meant to lose, but Kinuan countered that water did not lose, only change shape. Kinuan said Luca had potential. He noticed it even when he fended off bullets without a ballistic calculator, showing incredible reflexes. He added that he was extremely surprised when Luke asked him to be his teacher, because a man with such talent came to him as if guided by fate. Luca was embarrassed to notice that Kinuan was pulling something on the compliments, to which he only apologized, his words catching Luca off guard. Kinuan warned with a serious look that Luca might not come out of this fight alive, and his words made the man tense up. The loud voice of the commentator announced that the debutante was challenging the storm of the arena, Gabriel Iron Fist, and whether or not this kid would make it back to his mommy alive. The commentator called Luca a punk who hadn't even smelled powder yet, and introduced him as Huda Boy, to which Luca thought that he had to come up with such a nickname. The crowd of spectators began booing Luca, shouting, "Ew, what a sucker!" Their contemptuous shouts echoing throughout the Colosseum. They looked forward to the bloodbath, anticipating the cruel spectacle, their eyes burning with excitement and lust for other people's pain and suffering. Luca was seized by a dark desire to see another man's blood and guts. Something inexplicable pushed him here, into this arena of death and violence. He thought they seemed eager to see him torn to shreds, and it wasn't bad, even good, he felt at home. He entered the arena feeling as if he had returned home to the familiar atmosphere of brutality, violence, and struggle for survival. He grinned, wondering how they lived here without him. These fucking losers, his gaze full of contempt and superiority. As a child, he was constantly hungry. It was a difficult time, full of deprivation and struggle for every piece of bread, for every opportunity to survive. Officials from Akrisha brought rations to the orphanage once a month, but half went to waste and the director sold them in the slums, condemning the children to starvation. But even starving, he worked out hard, avidly reading dusty books that no one cared about and lugging rusty iron to pump his muscles. The other children from the orphanage shouted at Luca that he was a fool, why he was wasting his energy, because he would only get hungrier from this pointless training. He replied with cold determination that if he got hungry, he would simply take food from others, for in this cruel world, the strongest survived. He understood well how this world was organized. The strong always feasted and the weak starved. It was, is, and will always be so. It was the law of life. The kids shouted with disdain that he was showing off, because he was from the same double-digit orphanage as them, no better. They added with a sneer that if he had been better than them, he would have gotten into a single-digit orphanage. But as it was, he was just a slum rat. But Luca didn't listen to the grumblings of the losers. He silently continued his grueling training, paying no attention to their empty words. At the age of 12, he passed the second selection for the Guard, and at 15, he had already become a cadet, his perseverance and labor having borne fruit. He thought with disdain that they didn't have the brains to realize what he was capable of. His goals were far beyond their comprehension. He mentally said goodbye to the misfits, leaving them behind, and rushed towards his new life, full of danger and challenges, but also opportunities. So he lived in the barracks, forgetting the slums, and thought he would never go back there again. But fate decided otherwise, bringing him back. The crowd chanted Gabriel's name, and Luca thought with annoyance, what a brat they gave him to compete with. It was ridiculous and humiliating. Gabriel thought with disdain that Aleph had sniffed too much today to put such a minnow against him. But money didn't smell, and he was ready to fight. Luca studied his opponent, Gabriel Iron Fist, carefully, noting all of his strengths and weaknesses, preparing for battle. He noticed that the prosthetics on Gabriel's arms and legs were from different manufacturers. The symmetry of his body was broken, and his spine was crooked. But he was strong, for he had remodeled his body just for the sake of strength, and it made Luca both respect and despise that choice. Gabriel grinned, noting that Luca's face was all right, and offered him to be his servant, his words full of mockery. Luca replied with a cold smile that it was a good idea, because he definitely couldn't do without a servant. His reply was full of sarcasm. He added that Gabriel would be crippled today, and his eyes flashed with cold determination. He was ready for a brutal and bloody fight. Gabriel asked with a sneer not to maim him so much that he had to ask to even wipe his own ass, his words full of contempt. The commentator excitedly announced that their world was a cruel place where violence and death ruled, and now they would see it in miniature. The commentator shouted with excitement, who would trample whom, who would emerge victorious from this cruel and bloody fight not for life, but for death. The bloodbath was beginning, and the crowd roared with excitement, anticipating a brutal spectacle full of pain, suffering, and perhaps even death. Luca thought uneasily that his opponent had combat prosthetics while he himself had regular prosthetics, putting him at a severe disadvantage. In other words, as he realized one accurate hit and he would be screwed, his chances of winning were slim to none in this unequal fight. With incredible speed, he dodged Gabriel's powerful blow, his prosthetics barely able to support the strain, but he continued to fight. He retaliated with a kick to Gabriel's body, but he didn't even seem to feel it. His armor was too strong for such attacks. Gabriel asked with a chuckle, his voice full of contempt for a weak opponent who couldn't hurt him. Luca thought with annoyance that if he had been wearing his combat prosthetics, his opponent would have already been blown to pieces by one precise and powerful blow. He realized that the arena was too small and he couldn't dodge forever. He needed to find a way to turn the tide of this hopeless fight. Any blow from Gabriel could have killed him, and his own attacks were like a puff of smoke to his opponent, causing no visible damage. And the crowd was against him too. They were chanting Gabriel's name, demanding his death, and it was weighing on Luca, robbing him of his last strength. The situation was one you wouldn't wish on your enemy. He was alone against everyone, with no chance of victory. But he wasn't going to give up without a fight. He wondered what Kinuan was trying to accomplish by bringing him here, to this arena of death, and remembered his words about the basis of Akia's fighting style. Kinuan said you had to adapt to what you had, use your strengths, even if they were few. Luca realized that wishes didn't solve problems. Weapons didn't fall from the sky, so he had to use what he had, even if it wasn't enough. Kinuan had stripped him of his arms and legs, replacing them with weak prosthetics, but left him his mechanical eye, and that was a very important detail. So he didn't want Luke to rely on brute force, but to use his intelligence, cunning, and tactical thinking to achieve victory. Adaptation. using what you have to the best of your ability. That's what Akia's fighting style was, and Luca was beginning to understand it. Gabriel's fist was heavy artillery. The shake of his shoulder was the trigger. His gaze was the muzzle, and the length of his arm was the range of the shot. It was his system. Except that, unlike real weapons, live targets had a short range, and the trajectory of the blow was too predictable for an experienced fighter. Kinuan thought with pride that Luca was a true genius. His ability to learn and adapt was simply amazing and incredible. He mentally turned to Luca, saying that he had already unknowingly grasped the very basics of the ancient and deadly Akia's fighting style. Kinuan urged Luca to unleash his talent, for he was capable of much more than he could imagine. His potential was immense. The crowd of onlookers shouted furiously to Gabriel why he was fiddling with the little fellow and demanded that he finish him off already, this dullard and upstart. Luca was more focused than ever. His brain was working at its limit. He could even predict Gabriel's blows by analyzing his movements. He wondered if he could do the same as instructor Kinuan, replicate his incredible self-defense technique in this fight. He laughed madly, feeling himself stirred by this thought, this opportunity to surpass himself and show everyone what he was capable of. He wondered if this was what Kinuan had been expecting from him. This breakthrough, this going beyond his normal capabilities and abilities. Gabriel wondered what he was doing, not understanding how Luca managed to dodge his powerful and precise attacks. He recalled with fury that he had told Luca as if his blows were no more than tickles to him, and that was the plain truth, not bragging. Luca asked with a chuckle, wondering if Gabriel thought he hadn't even scratched him, his words full of confidence and an implicit threat to his opponent. He realized that if there wasn't enough prosthetic power, it could be compensated for by something else, like stealth or tactics. With incredible agility, he jumped on Gabriel, wrapped his legs around his neck, and prepared to deliver a decisive and crushing blow. Gabriel cried out in horror, not expecting such a bold and unexpected tack from his seemingly weak and inexperienced opponent. Luca looked disdainfully at the crowd that wished him down and mentally wished them to wish it all they wanted. He didn't care. He proudly declared that he would rise so high that he wouldn't even hear their pathetic whispers. His words were full of confidence and determination. He walked out of the arena, leaving a defeated Gabriel behind. His victory was complete and unconditional. He had proven his strength and skill to all. He thought that on a real battlefield where everything was unpredictable, he wouldn't have been able to do that. His concentration would have been broken by the chaos of the battle. He had to admit that Kinuan was an excellent teacher. His methods were unusual but effective. He had helped Luca reach his potential. Kinuan looked with satisfaction at Luca, who stood before him and said briefly, "Well done, good boy," expressing his approval of his victory. Kinuan congratulated Luca on taking the first step on the path of Akia's victim, noting that an adjustment doesn't always mean a loss for a warrior. The instructor then held out some object to Luca, gesturing for him to take it, and in his mechanical hand was a credit chip. A surprised Luca suggested that it was his fee for the past fight, but Kinuan, holding up the briefcase, retorted with a chuckle. It turned out that the chip was for Gabriel's treatment, and Kinuan had advised him to show kindness, but Luca objected, considering himself a warrior, not a saint. Mentor gently pointed out that Luca didn't understand everything due to his age yet, and he only clenched his fist silently, frustratedly. Kinuan explained that his so-called kindness was not charity, but a calculated investment in the future, for useful connections are very important. The instructor added that creating favorable conditions for himself was an important quality of a good soldier that Luca should have remembered. Luca realized how wrong he had been about Kinuan, naively believing that he was teaching him solely because of his talent and their shared past. Now the boy realized that this was far from true, and Kinuan would certainly want his investment back, and would do it in such a way that he would be forced to agree. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the doctor patiently explained to Gabriel the incompatibility of his device with his prosthetics due to the narrow signal, advising the Hyper Lindell 9. Gabriel was in shock, not understanding where he was going to get the money for the latest model, and suspected that they were trying to rip him off. The doctor objected, mentioning that people lived with cheap prosthetics too. They just didn't modify themselves as much as Gabriel himself. He began to justify himself with a long-standing lack of money, and the doctor offered to buy back the current prostheses. But the amount would only be enough for household ones, not combat ones. In despair, Gabriel loudly expressed his indignation at the enormous cost, clearly doubting that they understood the sums involved, and huddled on his bunk in helplessness. At that very moment, Luca approached the room, intending to check on Gabriel, and mentally noted that he was glad to see him at least cheerful. Upon seeing Luca, Gabriel let out a furious, unintelligible growl, and his cybernetic coin-like eye flashed with unbridled anger. He immediately tried to pounce on the guy who had entered, shouting furiously about his intention to kill him and leave him with nothing to eat. Luca calmly reminded his defeated enemy of his warning before the fight about possible injury, to which Gabriel only cursed foully. Luca had an unfortunate thought that he shouldn't have provoked Gabriel, and he immediately remembered Kinuan's recent admonition. Gabriel collapsed back onto the bunk with a groan, and Luca looked at him, immersed in thoughts of the expensive Hyper Lindell 9 prosthetic. Luca asked the doctor if he could buy the prosthesis with the money he had, and he confirmed that he could afford it, but with some reservations. Gabriel, unable to believe his ears, called Luca a scumbag and demanded an explanation, to which he calmly replied that he was simply paying for his treatment. A perplexed Gabriel asked why Luca would pay for him, but the man only said he just felt like it, causing his defeated foe to question his rented nickname. The defeated giant pondered in confusion whether this unexpected act was a show of mercy on the part of the victor, which was unusual for him. Gathering his thoughts, Gabriel asked Good Boy his real name, and the man briefly introduced himself as Luke, looking at him without a shadow of hostility. Touched to the core, Gabriel promised Luca that he could come to him for help any time if he needed it. Gabriel recognized that he was now indebted to Luca, and the latter looked at him thoughtfully, pondering what had happened and Kinuan's words. Unexpectedly, Luca felt a pleasant feeling from the act, and then the action moved to the familiar training room of the Akricha Imperial Guard. In the hall, Elias immediately attacked Luca with a sharp leg kick from the turn, testing his reaction after the recent events in the arena. Luca reacted instantly, blocking the blow with his cybernetic arm, causing sparks to fly, showing his increased speed and strength. After a brief skirmish, Ile asked if Luca had learned Akias' style from instructor Kinuan, and received an affirmative answer. Elias disparagingly referred to Akis as street-style badasses using dirty tricks, but Luca admitted that though embarrassed himself, he trusted his mentor. Eli admitted that now he couldn't even dream of beating Luca in hand-to-hand combat, but noted that he was the only worthy opponent among the cadets. Eli looked at his friend thoughtfully, noting to himself that Luca seemed to be in an unusually good mood today after the fight. After a moment's hesitation, Elias asked Luca if he had a spare moment, and after a short thought, he agreed. The conversation led them to the visitation room of the Akricha Guard's training center, flooded with light from the huge panoramic windows of the modern building. Luca entered and saw Eli at a table with Lillian Ramones, and he hurriedly apologized, explaining that he had known her family for a long time. Lillian immediately went to Luca to ask why he was avoiding her, since she had so insistently asked to see him. Luca blandly replied that he wasn't interested, and he hoped she would understand his refusal by the fact that he hadn't come. Elias tried to soften his friend's harshness, but Luca cut him off, telling him to shut up as this whole situation was already annoying him. Lillian bluntly asked Luca what exactly he didn't like about her, to which he replied about his lack of time for relationships and his background. Listening to him, Lillian suggested with a smile that in that case he should all the more befriend her, hinting at his usefulness. Luca, with a weary sigh, objected that Lillian Ramones didn't understand him at all, clearly not grasping the true reasons for his detachment. He explained that it was too risky to rely on her aristocratic authority, for one whim of hers could ruin everything, and he sought autonomy. Elias intervened, pointing out the contradiction in his friendship with him, an aristocrat. But Luke firmly stated that he valued Elias as a friend, not a member of the nobility. Lillian quietly stated with obvious regret in her voice that Luca wasn't going to give her even the slightest chance to get close. Luca briefly confirmed her words with an expression of regret and firmly asked not to be disturbed again, placing the cup on the table. Elias called out to Luca as he walked away, wondering why he was being so rude to a girl who was clearly showing genuine interest in him. Luca explained that she wouldn't have fallen behind otherwise, to which Elias agreed, but still found his behavior unnecessarily harsh and insensitive. Luca admitted that he didn't understand why Lillian Ramones was so insistent on sticking it to him, suspecting some ulterior motive behind her behavior. Elijah assumed that Luca was just afraid of her because he didn't know her at all and offered to get to know her better, possibly changing his mind. Luca suddenly asked Eli directly if he liked Lillian himself, which confused his friend, catching him off guard. Elias started to stammer out a denial of his feelings, but Luca noticed that his breathing and gaze gave him away, for Akias had taught him to be observant. Luca indifferently stated that he didn't really care, and advised Eli if he felt anything for her to stop mumbling and act decisively. Eli answered quietly with a noticeable sadness in his voice that it was unfortunately not for him, making Luca aware of some of his internal obstacles. Meanwhile, the action shifted to the vast industrial complex of Akricha, where streams of red-hot energy powered vital city systems. Luca sat immersed in meditation, explaining to himself that this important training was aimed at maintaining equanimity in any situation. He mentally asked Kinuan how he would have acted in Alep's office in the fight, for his mentor had promised to tell him about it after his victory. Luca was still thinking about those armed bandits inside and out, not imagining how one could get out of there without weapons and serious injury. Wondering what Kinuan would do, he heard his mentor's unexpected reply that he would simply hide under the table, causing Luca to be extremely perplexed. Luca suggested whether Kinuan wanted him to take Aleph hostage and take away the bandits' weapons, to which the mentor confirmed that Luca's aggressive training would have led to an immediate attack. Kinuan calmly explained that Luca, being trained for aggression, would undoubtedly lunge at the bandits even under bullets, opening a window for him to maneuver, but Luca immediately questioned such a plan. Luca countered that they would both be riddled with bullets if that were the case. But Kinuan grimly pointed out that slum bosses don't live long in the slums, and Luca's actions would give Aleph's men an excuse to kill him. Kinuan explained with a chuckle that once Luca drew fire, he would deal with the bandits himself and get his apprentice out through the secret passage he knew. Luca was shocked that Kinuan had not only foreseen his actions, but knew of the secret passage, believing it to be some superhuman ability of his mentor. Kinuan revealed to Luca that Akis means sharp eye in the ancient language, and that Aki's victima utilizes all the resources of the brain by developing discernment, and told him to memorize it. It had come to Luca's attention that his mentor's brain problems were a consequence of using his powers to the limit, which puzzled him greatly and made him sympathetic. It suddenly dawned on Luca to wonder if the Aki's victima could not be used if Legion was worn, and Kinuan, recognizing he was right, noted his actual giftedness, for he had guessed it himself. Luca pondered the fact that he would get a Legion when he became a guard, but realized that no one could wear that armored prosthesis stuffed with the Empire's advanced technology all the time. This high-tech Legion suit consumed so many brain resources that an additional processor had to be attached, making Aki's victima simply incompatible with it in combat. Luca realized bitterly that Kinuan had known about it, but had kept silent, and blamed himself for his stupidity in not realizing that his mentor wouldn't waste time teaching a useless skill. A dejected Luca checked with his mentor to see if that meant that was the end of it, and turned around to thank instructor Kinuan for all the training and knowledge imparted. Kinuan calmly looked after him, telling Luca to come back any time if he changed his mind, leaving the door open for him to choose. Luca walked away, clenching his fists in frustration and disappointment, and mentally cursed, realizing the complexity of his situation and the difficult choice ahead. 3 months later, Luca, already in a stricter uniform, stood pensively in the doorway, reflecting on the time that had passed and the decisions that had been made. The commander of the Akricha Imperial Guard, Hamilis Castoria, regretted that he had been so busy that he had completely neglected his cadets lately. Castoria inquired about Luca's progress, mentioning Eli's words about the rebellion, and the man replied that he was training on his own, having not received any field assignments in a long time. The commander informed Luca that he would not be doing any more field assignments as he was fully prepared to become one, a true guard, to which Luca thanked him. Castoria, by the way, mentioned that he had heard of Luca's frequent meetings with instructor Kinuan, and Luca immediately realized the true reason for this unexpected summons. Luca assumed that the command most likely knew everything, both about his visit to the black market and his participation in the brutal battles of the underground arena. Castoria clarified whether instructor Kinuan had taught Luca the art of Akia's victima, to which the latter replied that he was no longer learning, and the commander guessed that Luca had gone off on his own. The commander chuckled at the suggestion that Luke had dropped out of the class because of Akia's victim's incompatibility with the Legion he would soon need, and asked if he realized it. Castoria explained that Kinuan himself weeds out the weaklings, and the able-bodied quickly realize the unnecessary nature of the technique, so it is only the instructor himself, surrounded by a blue aura, who wields it. Luca, visibly sweating, anxiously asked the commander if he really wanted him to continue studying Akia's victima without understanding his motives. Commander Castoria clarified that he wanted Luca to maintain a close relationship with Kinuan, and for that he'd better continue his training, calling it an order. Luca inwardly panicked, wondering why the guard commander was wary of Kinuan and watching this old soldier, and realized that no unnecessary questions should be asked. Gathering his courage, Luca agreed to continue his training, and Castoria, folding his cybernetic arms in satisfaction, informed him that he would be watching him closely. The commander remarked encouragingly that Luca was the kind of man who would go far, and he accepted his words with determination in his gaze as he stood in the light. Kinuan, being in some sort of workshop or shop with cybernetic parts, remarked in surprise that he hadn't expected to see Luca so soon, holding a robotic head in his hand. Luca silently thanked the instructor, and the instructor grinned and said that since Luca himself had talked about returning, he wouldn't ask anything. Luca thought to himself that he hadn't expected Kinuan to agree to take him back so easily after their recent conversation, which surprised him greatly. Luca asked why Kinuan was in the lower district today, and the latter, looking at a crate of toy robots, spoke wistfully of childhood dreams. Kinuan called out to the salesman, but the older man with cybernetics reading the paper muttered to look for himself if he needed anything since he didn't know anything. The instructor calmly asked for all the available toys and clarified about delivery, which shocked the seller, and Luca wondered why the mentor needed so many toys. They came to a large building with a gate, and Luca asked if it was a shelter, which was confirmed by a sign. Shelter number 47, lower neighborhood. Kinuan told Luca to take the boxes to the courtyard and then allowed him to rest, to which the boy briefly agreed, following his mentor. As they entered the courtyard, Kinuan suddenly called out to Luca, and he turned around warily, sensing some movement behind him. A furious Gabriel Iron Fist popped out from around the corner, wondering loudly if Luke had pulled him out for this petty errand. Gabriel shouted angrily at Luca to see if he thought he was an errand boy, clearly insulted by such a frivolous task from his recent adversary. Luca calmly reminded Gabriel of his own offer of help, explaining that he needed to take things to a place where they couldn't be delivered, but he was expecting something more serious. Luca thought with a slight chuckle that Gabriel must have been counting on him to help with the showdown, and mentally nudged him, doubting his combat usefulness. Gabriel stammered, and Luca noted to himself that the money for the treatment had not been wasted. With the new spine, the former Colosseum champion's balance had improved considerably. As Kinuan walked into the shelter, Gabriel asked Luca who the geezer was, clearly not recognizing the Imperial Guard instructor. Gabriel insisted that if this man was so important that Aleph himself trembled before him, he should know about him. But Luca advised him to stay out of it if life was precious. Luca thoughtfully suggested that Kinuan had probably grown up in this orphanage, and wondered if he was doing charity work after his success. At that moment, a bunch of hungry-looking children ran out of the orphanage with joyful cries, clearly delighted by the unexpected guests and gifts. The children surrounded Luca and Gabriel, thanking handsome brother and calling Uncle Ugly, to which Gabriel only muttered about the pudgy little thing. Luca sharply called out to the children as they began fighting over the boxes, shouting that they were the first to take and it was their booty, not wanting to share. He coldly told them to take by force, stating that there wasn't enough for everyone anyway, and if you wanted to get anything in this world, you had to be strong. Kinuan called out to Luca, reminding him that there were never enough resources for everyone in this cruel world, and one must fight for one's place. Kinuan then motioned for Luca to talk, beckoning him with his cybernetic hand, and they moved away from the clamoring children and Gabriel. Kinuan said he occasionally looks in on the slum, noting that the orphanage director's salary appears to be good and he clearly profits from the rations. Luca asked if this was where Kinuan grew up, but the man said he didn't remember anymore, just occasionally looking in the nearest shelters in the area. With a slight chuckle, Kinuan added that maybe he'd even been to Luca's orphanage, hinting at their possible shared past from the slums. Looking at the instructor, Luca thought that he was just a regular old soldier, a veteran with compromised health and a somewhat clouded mind. He saw in Kinuan an old warrior who had lost his former glory, and thought bitterly that perhaps he might meet the same unenviable fate. However, Luca immediately added to himself that this was only if he lived to his advanced years at all, and firmly suggested that Kinuan get down to business. Kinuan stared at Luca and asked directly why he had returned, his gaze becoming frighteningly piercing and intense. That look sent a chill down Luca's back, and he heard Kinuan's ingratiating question as to whether Commander Halis Castoria had ordered him back. Luca confusedly interjected what the instructor meant, trying not to look him in the eye as every wrong rustle could be a clue to the Kinuan. The boy panicked, wondering how Kinuan had figured out about the order and how much more he knew, and realized that if the man was hiding something dangerous, the chief centurion had a spy for a reason. Luca felt Kinuan's hand tense and realized that he could eliminate him right here and now if he deemed him a threat to himself. Kinuan calmly advised Luca to calm down if he wanted to live, his voice sounding quiet but no less threatening in the sunset rays. He added that if Luke attacked him at full strength, it would not be easy for him to resist without killing his disciple, hinting at his hidden power. Luca, visibly nervous, replied that he was a soldier of the Empire and that was all he could say at the moment, trying to keep his composure. Kinuan countered that Luca knew so little that he didn't even realize who he should join in this complex game of interests and factions. Luca noted to himself that Kinuan didn't blame him, as it was natural for a soldier to follow orders from above. But the Empire needed less than perfect soldiers. The instructor asked if Luca really thought he had come to him for the first time purely of his own free will, thus questioning his autonomy. Kinuan explained that their top had hissed back when Luke had demonstrated accurate trajectory prediction without any special equipment. After all, there was finally someone who could study Victim's arcane as well as himself, giving the Empire a powerful new weapon. Kinuan recalled how Luca was sure he had willingly come to study to become stronger after the incident with Korra, but it was a planned outcome by the Empire. Luca tried to convince himself not to let Kinuan's words throw him off, remembering the encounter with the enemy and his personal decision to become stronger and choose an instructor. He firmly stated that he had made his choice, but Kinuan countered that every person in this world was someone's slave, whether they knew it or not. The instructor added with a chuckle that Luca was probably running from the truth right now because he was still too young and inexperienced in such matters. Kinuan allowed Luca to return and report everything to Camillus if he wished, letting him go in peace, but with a clear hint of further events to come. Luca stared silently at the departing Kinuan, mentally repeating that he didn't believe his words, but doubts were beginning to plague him from within. However, he recognized that, just as Kinuan had said, Chief Centurion Camillus did want him to continue studying the Victim Arcane, and that was a fact. Luca's mind was filled with conflicting thoughts and orders. Don't doubt the Empire. Don't fall for Kinuan's speeches. Don't dare contrive and become even stronger. But he began to be tormented by the thought that even his own thirst for success was not his own will, but something imposed from outside, like a drop of blood. If so, then who is he really? And what is his true role in this complex game where he is just a pawn? The action shifted to the simulation training room, where rows and rows of high-tech pods stood for practicing combat skills and tactics. Luca, dressed in his training suit, sat clutching his head, thinking with annoyance that he had never been able to report the incident to Chief Centurion Camillus. Luca figured that if he had reported, he would have been tortured with psychological tests for possible exposure to dangerous ideology, and his numbers would have been lower. He realized that the Empire did not forgive those who did not share its interests, and at worst, he could be demoted from the military to the working class. Kinuan, in his mind, probably knew he was too hesitant to denounce, remembering his mentor's words about being ready for tests if he made up his mind. And for that, as he realized, it was necessary to meet someone. And immediately a glowing energy passage appeared in front of him, leading into the unknown. As Luke emerged from the passage, he saw Elias and noted his progress, to which he replied that countless defeats had only made him stronger. Elijah grinned, noting that he was flattered that Luca had come all this way to cheer him up, but the man went straight to his request. Luca reminded Eli of his own words about aristocrats being able to pay their way into places, calling it a well-known secret, because ineptitude didn't even do well in training. He bluntly asked Eli how he had even managed to pass the psychological testing at the selection trials, knowing his true views and aspirations. Elias, getting serious, asked if Luca realized how dangerous his request was, and offered to share his secret method, if any. Luca assured that he had checked and there was no one around, and he was signing up for this solely for the sake of the Empire. And Elias, realizing the seriousness, acknowledged the method. When asked by Luca about the method, Eli answered with sadness and a tear protruding from his eyes that he just didn't seem to have any other choice in that situation. Eli explained that one should create a perfect dummy image for others, while locking one's real personality deep inside oneself. Luca didn't understand what Elias was talking about, and he explained using the example of memory loss due to a traumatic event, only it had to be done consciously. Luca asked doubtfully and scoldingly if it was even possible, but immediately assumed that Elias wouldn't tell if it were impossible, since their brains live under constant upheaval. Eli told him that if one behaved like a loyal soldier, it would imprint a personality, and he spent 2 months before selection praising the Emperor daily, copying his father. He warned Luca that the problem was that his real self might be affected by prolonged use of the technique, and he risked losing himself. Luca decided that if the method was really that simple, he didn't even need to pretend. He would continue acting as before, becoming the person he was before Kinuan and Elias. Elias, noticing his friend's strange determination, advised Luca to be careful whatever he was up to, sensing something amiss in his words. He also added that everything about psychological testing is a thing that is extremely dangerous and unpredictable and not to be trifled with. Luca looked at Eli in surprise, noting to himself that he never thought the day would come when he would hear such grave warnings from him. At that moment, Eli, sipping from his flask, saw the holographic notification of an incoming call from Kinuan and mentally chided himself for the extremely ill-timed call. Luca and Kinuan stood in the lower quadrant opposite a tall, modern building flooded with sunlight, while the usual passers-by of citizens snooped around them. Kinuan informed Luca that they had a fairly simple practice today, looking down at him with a sly grin, anticipating the task ahead. He grinned at the kosher building the local gangsters had built for themselves, and Luca thought to himself that he was teaching him as if nothing had happened at the orphanage. This ostensible calm made Luca even more uncomfortable, and then Kinuan, pointing a cybernetic hand at him, gave him only 20 seconds to comply. The instructor ordered Luca to take down all the bandits inside this building, and the man, with a short nod, confirmed that he understood and was ready for action. Without wasting time, Luca took out the locked door with one powerful blow of his cybernetic arm, sending sparks and metal shards flying. Inside the room sat a large, cybernetically enhanced man in camouflage pants who looked surprised at the unexpected intruder. The man squinted warily when he saw Luca enter, clearly not expecting such a bold intrusion into his lair, full of his armed associates. He asked Luca rudely what he wanted, noting that he didn't look like an ordinary visitor, and loomed over him threateningly. Luca instantly assessed the situation, noting to himself that one dumbass with a gun in his pocket immediately approached him, ready to attack. He noticed 3 more armed thugs at the card table, who clearly hadn't expected such a sudden and audacious intrusion into their card game. The man sitting at the head of the table looked at Luca with disdain, calling him a puppy, and Luca realized that this was probably their leader. He also sensed someone's presence in the bathroom, suggesting that someone might be hiding or ambushed there, ready for a fight. The bandit blocking Luca's path growled that he hadn't planned on cracking open children's skulls early in the morning, but such was life, and swung around to strike. Luca dodged the attack with lightning speed, and the cybernetic arm of the bandit crashed into the wall with tremendous force, leaving a deep dent in it. The other bandits at the table jumped to their feet, grabbing their weapons, clearly not expecting this young and seemingly inexperienced guy to be so quick. Luca clenched his fist, thinking that he had been worrying too much lately and he definitely needed to blow off some steam properly. He snatched the gun from the nearest bandit, pointing it at the others, his movements quick, precise, and deadly like a seasoned fighter. Shots rang out and bullets flew at the bandits, who panicked and tried to take cover or shoot back. But Luca was too fast for them. The leader of the bandits, wounded, shouted with rage that the rat boy had shot him and returned fire, but it was too late. Luca noticed with disdain that he was aiming like shit, and he couldn't believe that such inexperienced people dared to commit murders in this city. At that moment, another thug with an energy baton popped out of the bathroom, clearly not realizing what was going on here or where all the noise was coming from. When he saw the defeated comrades and Luca with his pistol, he was dazed, not knowing what to do in this unexpected and dangerous situation for him. Luca coldly advised him to play dead if he wanted to survive, as he would be sorry to lose such expensive limbs in a pointless fight. Before the bandit could react, the bathroom door exploded with a powerful energy discharge, filling the room with bright light and debris. Luca, looking at the last enemy disarmed, thought it felt like there was someone in the bathroom and decided to check it out. He cautiously approached the glowing opening, behind which a dark silhouette could be seen, and prepared himself for another possible confrontation with an unknown foe. When he looked inside, he saw the bound girl on the floor, and he thought with anger that these bandits were real scum for doing this to defenseless people. Kinuan, who had appeared in the doorway, noted with a chuckle that Luca had managed almost 20 seconds, clearly pleased with his student's speed and efficiency. Luca carried the bound girl out in his arms, and Kinuan nodded approvingly and praised him for a job well done. But he was clearly in a bad mood. With a grim look, Luca said he wanted to finish the bastards off, but Kinuan stopped him, reminding him that they were guests here and there was no need for unnecessary interference. He added that this world is full of people who lack the strength to defend themselves, and Luca, more than anyone else, should know what usually happens to them. Luca thought that this girl had suffered such a fate because she was unable to fight while he himself fought desperately for strength. Kinuan continued to drive him to the lower sector, constantly pushing him into battles without any prior information, testing his strength and endurance. Luca realized that Kinuan wasn't doing this to teach him how to win, but to teach him how to think about how to handle the situation he found himself in. Kinuan continued to silently send him into battle without saying a word, forcing Luca to make his own decisions and take responsibility for them. Their path led them to a small workshop with a neon sign that looked rather modest against the more modern buildings surrounding it. A young red-haired girl in work overalls and glasses came out of the workshop and, wiping sweat from her forehead, greeted them cheerfully. Kinuan asked Gilda to make him coffee like in the good old days, with butter, and offered Luca some milk. But he asked for coffee too, only without butter. Luca asked if there was any need to stop by Gilda's workshop, and Kinuan replied that this was the girl he had rescued, and wasn't he proud of her progress. Luca rescued Gilda from bandit captivity, remembering this recent event with a sense of deep satisfaction and duty. After listening to her, Luca realized that the bandits had kidnapped the girl because of her friend's debt and subjected her to unthinkable horrors for 6 whole months. Kinuan revealed that Gilda was from the orphanage, incredibly talented in engineering, and he secretly paid for her training, not wanting publicity. Suddenly, Gabriel, the former Colosseum champion, entered the room, exclaiming in surprise at the sight of Luca, calling him a pie boy. Gabriel asked for a beer, but Gilda, showing concern, reminded him that his nervous system was already overloaded and he shouldn't drink. Kinuan grinned and advised Gabriel to listen to his mechanic, but the big man only waved it off, thinking the beer was harmless. Gabriel then anxiously asked Kinuan if he was stirring up the whole town, incurring the wrath of the gangs and risking everything around him. Kinuan, remaining unperturbed, assured that there was nothing to worry about, for they planned to leave these places for a long time soon. Gilda asked excitedly what "not for a while" meant, but Kinuan only shrugged, answering vaguely about months or even years. Luca thought sadly that soon they would be barred from the lower sector altogether, because as a trainee, he was not allowed to leave the base without supervision. He felt a deep longing, for this meeting with Gilda and Gabriel, those people from the lower sector, could be his last. Luca marveled at Gilda's resilience in being able to get back to life and work after everything, and she asked them not to forget her. Gabriel, continuing his dangerous craft as a fighter, hopefully offered to throw a farewell party, not wanting to part ways. Kinuan, noticing Luca's sentimental mood, sternly cut short his musings, saying that there was no need to pity these people. The mentor added very coldly that Luca would have absolutely no further opportunity to return to this place and see them. Tasting the disgusting-tasting coffee, Luca thought bitterly that such a farewell might be the best outcome in his situation. Luke then found himself in front of the imposing door of the Chief Centurion's office, anticipating a serious and difficult conversation with him. He was met in his office by Commander Hamilis Castoria, who grudgingly remarked that Instructor Kinuan was once again being willful. Castoria remembered that Kinuan had become a trainee at a late age, something not normally allowed, but times were hard for the Empire. The commander admitted that he had never figured out Kinuan, who was already an influential figure in the Guard when he himself had just started in the service. Luca thought anxiously that Kinuan was probably a specialist in covert operations, and information about him was hidden even from the Chief Centurion. Castoria noted that Kinuan seemed to have gotten through to Luca, unlike past trainees who didn't stay under his command for long. The commander described Luca as exceptional, yet vulnerable to bad influences, and scheduled him for a mandatory psychological test immediately. Luca obediently agreed, noting to himself that this was exactly the turn of events he had expected from the command in this difficult situation. Castoria had honestly told Luca of 2 paths for trainees on such missions: elimination for secrecy or reward with a significant promotion. The commander hoped that Luca would take the second path, but the latter only assured that he would simply follow the orders given to him. Castoria promised with a burning eye that if the operation was successful, he would certainly put in a good word for Luca with his superiors. The commander promised to personally promote Luca if he did well, and even, to the young man's utter amazement, offered to adopt him out of the blue. Luca was completely stunned by such a statement, unable to believe the commander's words about Luca Castoria and his true hidden intentions. A shocking thought flashed through Luca's mind. Was the Chief Centurion really going to make him a member of his powerful aristocratic family? While he was being prepared for the test, Luca remembered that the Castoria surname belonged to one of the most privileged families of the powerful empire of Acretia. The soulless voice of the machine announced the beginning of psychological testing, and Luca, gathering his will in a fist, mentally prepared for the upcoming test. The testing machine nonchalantly registered the joy on Luca's face, immediately asking him if something very good had happened. Luca irritably replied to the machine that it was none of its business and demanded that it immediately begin the test itself, skillfully hiding his true emotions. The powerful blow of his fist symbolized the beginning of a severe psychological ordeal that descended upon Luca's mind with all its inhuman force. During the test, Luca experienced intense battle scenes, desperately fighting unseen enemies in the depths of his mind or heavy memories. Mechanical fingers gingerly touched the unknown yellowish substance, hinting at some hidden method or special preparation of Eli for the test. Eli looked haggard and depressed, as if he had just gone through an ordeal that had left a really deep emotional mark on him. Luca saw Eli practicing to the point of exhaustion and wondered if this was the Eli he had always known so well. Luca asked Eli about the test, and he confirmed success thanks to it, after which Luca, seeing his condition, worriedly offered his friend his help. Eli answered Luca with a mysterious look that he wasn't ready to tell him everything yet, but he would definitely ask for his help very soon. Luca firmly promised that if Elias was in danger during the fight, he would certainly help, even at the cost of his own life, and the man thanked him. Elias repeated that he would explain everything soon, adding anxiously that he hoped for a better outcome than the one he was imagining now. Luca thought he would have lied if Elias had asked for help. For now, having passed the test and gained his trust, his goal was to become Castoria's son. At that moment, only that thought possessed his mind when Commander Castoria announced that from now on they would operate under a new special unit. The commander explained that their goal would be to quell the dangerous rebels who had risen up against the Empire, and this force consisted of 3 families led by the Ramones. Luca was shocked to the core when he heard the familiar and very meaningful surname Ramones, which caused him a storm of emotion. The memory of Lillian Ramones pierced him, and he realized exactly what kind of help Elias was probably so desperate to ask him for. A huge, ominous starship with red lights was waiting for them in the hangar, where numerous soldiers were already massing in full readiness. Clad in the latest battle suits, the guardsmen, Luca among them, were resolutely climbing the gangway aboard the formidable warship. Luca imagined that from this moment on he was the commander of the 21st Platoon of the Suppression Army, feeling the weight of the new responsibility. The soldiers of his new platoon saluted Luca, cheering their unexpectedly appointed young commander before an important mission. Luca wondered with bewilderment why the command assigned an inexperienced trainee as a platoon leader. Were they really using the uprising as mere training? He was informed that the platoon of 27 men was divided into 2 squads, and his assistant would be Sergeant Kodrak, a seasoned veteran by contrast. Luca realized that these veterans understood that they were only a tool for his training and were unlikely to trust the orders of an inexperienced youngster. He pondered how he should proceed with 2 options. The first was to put all the responsibility on the experienced Sergeant Kodrak, who would handle everything. The second way, however, required a completely different, more decisive approach, and Luca looked intently, defiantly, directly at Sergeant Kodrak. Luca firmly stated that he was in charge, demanding unquestioning obedience to his orders and warning that disobedience would be punished. Sergeant Kodrak tried to address Commander Luca, but the latter interrupted him rudely and very sharply, not even allowing him to finish his sentence. With one lightning-fast and brutal blow, Luca felled the sergeant in front of the entire platoon, determined to cut off any resistance with brute force at once. Luca angrily asked Sergeant Kodrak how dare he touch the older man without permission, and if he thought he was an idiot because of his age. He reminded them that he, like them, was from the lower sector, a young orphan, but then questioned them about the reason for the vast difference in their situation. Luca stated with icy certainty that the reason for this difference was because he was immeasurably superior to every single one of them on the battlefield. He promised with burning eyes that they would realize it themselves very soon, because he was the best platoon leader they had ever met. Sergeant Kodrak, clearly impressed, admitted his mistake and promised to be more courteous to Commander Luca and his orders from now on. Luca noted to himself with satisfaction that the sergeant was adapting quickly and realized at once that he was not looking for easy or simple ways. The action moved to an Imperial Army outpost dangerously close to a well-fortified enemy impregnable fort. Inside the outpost, in a large briefing room, numerous soldiers were gathered, awaiting further instructions from the Empire's high command. Elias thought with slight surprise and a barely perceptible chuckle at the fact that Luca hadn't held back after all, and had beaten up one of the squad members in a showy manner. Luca explained that his assistant was going to treat him like a child, to which Elias remarked that in their eyes they were children, and without toughness they would not be respected. Commander Castoria, deciding to skip the unnecessary formalities, got straight to the point, activating a large holographic sphere for the upcoming important briefing. He reported that the rebels had insidiously infiltrated the shrine of an ancient mystical civilization, and now this magical fortress was under their complete undivided control. Castoria explained that the area is bounded by a dense dome-shaped barrier that serves as a solid defense, and dangerous magical turrets for aerial targets have been spotted there. There were only 5 such turrets, and the 11th Armored Brigade was tasked with destroying them while the rest of the army attacked from different strategic directions. The armored brigades were fully clad in all-metal armor, and Luca realized that the Empire had engaged massive forces to quell this rebellion. The commander announced that the operation would begin at exactly 14 hours and 10 minutes, that is, 1 hour and 30 minutes later, ordering everyone to be ready. Luca suggested that their role would only be support, to which Elias sarcastically remarked that it was more like a picnic since they were being so spared, calling Luca a grump. Elias started to speak, but Luca shrewdly interrupted him, suggesting that it was about the Ramones family, which surprised his friend. Luke seriously warned Elias that despite their possible closeness, they were powerless now, and interceding for the traitors would ruin even his powerful family. Eli admitted bitterly that he had no illusions, but if given even the slightest chance, he would desperately want to save at least one Lillian. Luca incredulously asked if Elias loved her enough to risk his life, to which he replied about first love, and Luca thought about trying to snag him and Lillian's reluctance to be an aristocrat. Luca angrily demanded that Eli pull himself together, for his antics were out of line, and saving Lillian would get him executed. He sternly warned Eli not to do anything stupid, and that should have been considered his last serious warning. With a heavy heart, Eli looked silently after the departing Luca, who left him alone with this unspoken and dangerous intention. Luca thought with annoyance that Victim's Arcoes style helped him recognize the lie, and Elias had plotted to save Lillian anyway, despite the mortal risk. He decided that for Eli's own sake, Lillian Ramones must die, regardless of whether his friend would accept this cruel and bitter truth. Luca thought with breathless hope that this would happen in the midst of the coming chaos, and begged fate that she would not cross paths with Eli alive ever again. Eli, for his part, pacing the hallway alone, desperately wished for a different outcome that would allow him to save the one he cared so much about. Luca focused grimly, reminding himself that the most important things in a soldier's body were the head and chest, key areas for survival on the battlefield. He pondered that as long as the head and chest were intact, the soldiers would not die, for the Empire's cybernetics would bring them back to life as long as there was breath and blood to nourish the brain. Sergeant Kodrak approached the seated Luca, addressing him as platoon leader, and Luca calmly told him to say what was on his mind. The sergeant said he was well aware of Luca's abilities, having carefully studied his characterization from his superiors, and asked what to make of it now. Kodrak asked to heed his words in battle, as he had been serving the Empire for 10 years, and his experience and skills were worth something too, despite everything. Luca assured the sergeant not to worry about it, as he would always listen to any opinion if it seemed really reasonable. Sergeant Kodrak bowed with obvious relief and gratitude to his young, but already so determined and adamant commander. Imperial troops approached the enemy citadel, protected by a huge blue energy dome that stretched over its entire area. Heavy battle mechs landed on the rocky surface of the planet, raising clouds of dust and preparing for the upcoming assault on the enemy fortifications. A squad of black assault mechs with red glowing elements moved forward confidently, embodying the full might of the Imperial war machine. The audience was presented with an armored brigade in all mechanical armor, a model of which was called Myrmidon, inspiring awe with its formidable appearance alone. Luke regarded these massive Myrmidons with interest and some tension, wondering about their true combat effectiveness in action. It was explained to the soldiers that the task of the Myrmidons was to destroy the turrets, after which it would be their turn to attack the main enemy forces under the dome. The heavy guns of the Myrmidons opened a barrage of fire on the enemy positions, marking the beginning of a brutal and bloody battle for the fortress. The massive Myrmidons rushed to the attack, firing missiles and continuous fire, their armored hulls hurtling forward with unrelenting fury. In a hail of gunfire and explosions, the Myrmidons burst toward the blue energy dome surrounding the enemy citadel, leaving only destruction in their wake. Fire projectiles fired by the Myrmidons rained down on the fortress's protective dome, trying to pierce a breach in its impenetrable magical defenses. As a result of massive shelling, there was a powerful explosion. A blinding flash illuminated the battlefield and shook the ground beneath the feet of the fighters. A beam of bright energy pierced the protective dome, and the Myrmidons immediately seized the opportunity, rushing into the resulting gap in the defense. Imperial artillery units opened heavy fire on the weakened dome, supporting the advance of the Myrmidon armored assault brigades. The shells burst one after another, causing massive damage to enemy defenses and creating chaos and panic among the defending insurgents. A huge blast of fire marked the successful breach in the fortress's defenses, opening the way for the Imperial forces to continue their advance inward. Luca watched the battle with tension, realizing that now everything depended on whether the Myrmidons could neutralize the remaining enemy turrets. He realized that if they failed, their battle would take place under far worse conditions, and the strategic simulator predicted only 1 minute to do so. If the Myrmidon squad fails, the suppression forces will have to enter the battle as is and pay a very high price for it. Soon came the report that the turrets had been successfully neutralized, and the command gave the order to move on to the next, no less important stage of the operation. The fighters took the news with joyful shouts and excitement, because the battlefield, though a cruel place, gave them an incredible adrenaline rush. Luca admitted to himself with a predatory grin that he enjoyed it, for he was the kind of man who was driven by ambition and hype, and without it he would have gone mad long ago. He decisively ordered to depart, feeling that it was his turn to test his mettle in this grand and dangerous battle for the Empire. The plan was to attack simultaneously from different directions to sweep every room and not let a single rebel escape the Empire's justice. The underground tunnels of the magical fortress resembled a tangled labyrinth, with familiar paths going hundreds of meters deep, hiding many dangers. The Imperials advanced through the smoke and explosions through the ruined corridors of the fortress, expecting an enemy attack from around every corner of this labyrinth. Luke assumed that the rebels must have narrowed the tunnels so the huge myrmidons couldn't get through, creating bottlenecks for defense. Luke, in his black battlesuit, peered out from around the corner, ready to meet the enemy in the dark and dangerous tunnels of the enemy fortress. He firmly told the sergeant that he would go first from here, to which Kodrak remarked that it was a dangerous move, for the chance of ambush was very high. The sergeant honestly admitted that he was afraid of the consequences if Luca died, because then all the responsibility for the failure of the mission would fall on his shoulders. Luca coldly replied that he didn't care about what would happen after his death, and he wasn't at all concerned about a possible cut in Kodrak's salary. He firmly repeated that he was going first and the others should follow, and in his black suit he rushed forward through the dark tunnel. The sergeant felt goosebumps run down his back as if he'd already been shot in the back, but realized that now was not the time to worry about that. Luca was obsessed with finding and eliminating Lillian Ramones before she could meet Eli and thus endanger him. He assumed that Eli was already in the tunnels, but on the other hand, and if he wanted to get rid of the tail in the form of his soldiers, he would also go for a breakthrough. Luca thought about letting his men go to waste, but he couldn't let personal feelings take the lives of his loyal soldiers because of it. So he decided to meet the risks himself, face to face, and moved alone deep into enemy territory, ready for any surprises. Sergeant Kodrak and his men rushed anxiously after their commander, shouting his name in hopes of stopping or at least catching up with him. Luca, shrouded in red energy, carried forward, his blade leaving a bright trail behind him. He was ready for any fight in these dangerous tunnels. Using the Arcade's fighting style, he had sharpened his senses to the extreme. His sight, hearing, touch, and even his sense of smell had become incredibly sensitive. Even his taste helped him. Picking up traces of chemistry in the air with his tongue, he gained tons of information about his surroundings and possible enemy. His energy blades cut through the air, deflecting attacks and forcing their way through the ranks of enemies who tried to stop his rapid advance. Sergeant Kodrak and his men were shocked to the core to see the incredible speed and fighting power of their young but so skillful commander. Luca could feel his arteries expanding to the frantic rhythm of his heart, and the flow of blood continuously delivering glucose to his brain, sustaining it. He was incredibly pissed off that the soldiers were so slow, and he wanted to punch Kodrak in the face for constantly holding him back. He knew in theory, but now felt it on his own skin, that prolonged use of victims' arcas was causing increasing and very serious damage to the brain. Despite this, he continued his deadly dance with incredible speed and fury, bursting through the enemy barriers into the depths of the fortress. 3 Imperial soldiers with tense faces and weapons at the ready were cautiously advancing through the dark and dangerous tunnel of the enemy fortress. Luca, like a released arrow, swept past the huge defeated Myrmidon, continuing his unstoppable onslaught into the depths of the enemy fortifications. In his black battlesuit with red glowing elements, Luke looked like a fearsome predator ready to tear apart anyone who got in his way. Kodrak's soldiers opened a barrage of fire on the enemy, covering their commander as he, with blazing red eyes, prepared for another attack. Luca, surrounded by a vortex of red energy, performed an incredible pirouette, his blades leaving deadly trails behind him, sweeping enemies out of the way. One of the rebels was mercilessly felled by Luca's precise blow. Blood splattered in all directions, staining the walls of the tunnel purple. Even under the barrage of enemy fire, Luke continued his advance, his armor withstanding the hits, and he himself remained unharmed and full of rage. One of Kodrak's soldiers fired his energy weapon with a furious shout, trying to quell the resistance of the entrenched rebels ahead. A powerful explosion shook the tunnel, raising clouds of dust and debris. But Luca, enveloped in flames, only sped up his run, oblivious to the danger. Traces of blood on the floor indicated that a brutal fight had just taken place here, and Luca realized that his men would soon catch up with him here. Luca looked at the approaching Kodrak with slight impatience, ironically asking why it had taken him so long to reach him through this tunnel. Without waiting for a reply, Luca coldly threw that they were moving on, and his silhouette, shrouded in a red glow, once again rushed into the uncharted depths. Kodrak's soldiers, barely out of breath, opened fire again, covering their irrepressible commander who was single-handedly breaking through the enemy ranks. Luca, dodging shots, continued his deadly offensive. His movements were fast and precise, leaving his enemies no chance. He was surprised to note that there were such extensive rooms underground, and assumed that this was where the enemy's main line of defense was located. Luca realized that he had already gone too far, but he was sure that intercepting the fleeing aristocrats here wouldn't be too difficult for him. He activated his reconnaissance drone, which immediately soared into the air, ready to provide him with all the tactical information he needed about the enemy. The drone revealed that their defense line consisted of about 100 warriors, ready to defend their position to the last man against the Imperial invaders. And behind them, unarmed men could clearly be seen retreating, and Luca realized that Lillian was probably somewhere among them right now. One of the soldiers worriedly remarked that their squad was moving too fast and suggested that they wait for the others so as not to be outnumbered. Luca recognized that the suggestion was reasonable, but his brain was already severely overloaded due to his heavy use of the arcane victim combat style. Suddenly, his black battlesuit lit up with a red glow as he noticed some movement and flashes of fire in the distance behind the backs of his enemies. He was surprised to realize that the shots were not aimed at them, but at someone else behind the defending rebels. There was some serious confusion behind enemy lines, and Luca speculated that perhaps another Imperial unit had arrived with them for support. He figured there was only one other man besides him who would be in such a hurry, and taking advantage of the enemy's confusion, he commanded, "Full speed ahead." The Imperial soldiers, shielded by their shields, rushed into the attack under heavy enemy fire, their shields sparking from the hits of enemy rounds. One of the soldiers shouted in despair that their shields would not last long, but Luke sternly ordered them to hold on, for it was not yet time to retreat or surrender. Luca realized that the only thing to fear were guns that could kill him with one precise shot, piercing through his reinforced armor. One of the fighters reported that the enemy had about 8 guns with very high firepower, capable of doing them really serious damage. Luke decided to wait until at least half of the enemy guns had gone to reload to gain a tactical advantage in this battle. He shouted, "Now!" and ordered everyone to scatter and take cover as the enemies focused their fire on him as the main target of the attack. Sergeant Kodrak looked at his commander with horror and disbelief, who was single-handedly going to draw the full fire of those powerful guns. Luca calmly remarked that rifles and pistols could be neglected, as such light attacks would not be able to penetrate his sturdy battle armor, which meant he could focus entirely on dodging the really dangerous shots from the heavy guns, ignoring the minor damage. He decided to deal with the maximum threat weapons first to ensure the safety of his squad and accomplish the mission. The rebels opened a barrage of fire at him with all kinds of weapons, but Luke used his incredible speed and agility to dodge the shots. He deftly slipped between the enemy soldiers, realizing they couldn't fire while he was so close, between them and their targets. With a cry of, "No one can stop me now," Luke unleashed all his fury and power on the stunned rebels, sweeping them away one by one in battle. One of the rebels, terrified of the unstoppable Luca, raised his hands in despair and shouted that he was surrendering, unwilling to fight any longer. Luca coldly ordered Kodrak to chain up the remaining rioters, and the sergeant obediently replied, "Yes, platoon leader," following his commander's orders. Luca realized with horror that the dead soldiers were from Eli's squad, and he must have assigned them to attack from the rear, sacrificing them for his goal. He cursed Eli Karfika in rage, unable to believe that he was so desperate that he was willing to sacrifice the lives of his men for this Lillian. Luca was faced with a difficult choice, to help Eli or to remain a loyal soldier of the Empire, realizing that by choosing one, he would have to give up the other. Eli, for his part, felt this situation pissing him off more and more, forcing him to make increasingly desperate and risky decisions to save himself. Luca clenched his fist, deciding that if he met Lillian Ramones, he would kill her on the spot, and he didn't care if Elias hated him for it. The important thing was to save his friend. He ordered Kodrak to continue the arrest until reinforcements arrived, and himself, leaving command to the sergeant, rushed off to find Eli alone. Sergeant Kodrak looked anxiously at the departing platoon leader, unsure of what lay ahead of them in these dangerous and confusing tunnels. He recognized Luca as an excellent soldier whose combat skills shocked everyone, but called him a mediocre commander, which greatly surprised his leader. Luca countered that the losses would be more severe without him, and asked what the nature of the claim was, to which Kodrak replied about his single breakthroughs and reliance on force. The sergeant firmly stated that such methods do not make Luca a good commander, as he does not lead the men, but acts alone and flat out. Luca advised with a chuckle, blaming his own worthlessness, doubting that they were capable of implementing his tactics, or even just understanding its true nature. One of the soldiers remarked that it was ridiculous to whine about not being used, for the day would come when even the strongest fighters would need the help of the weak. Luca ironically offered Kodrak a laugh if such a day came, and the latter, accepting the challenge, promised to memorize these words of Luca's squad leader. Luca assured him that he would take the first mate's advice to heart and, if his methods proved faulty, would reconsider his strategy, which surprised the sergeant. Kodrak had not expected such an inflated ego to be capable of flexible thinking, and sincerely wished his young commander all the best ahead. Luca raced through the scorched walls and empty shells of the corridors, seeing the corpses of aristocrats clutching weapons who were trying to buy some time. He understood that similar things could be seen in the neighboring corridors, as most of the suppression army had successfully invaded and already punished the rebels. Luca had to admit that Elias wasn't just someone he could rely on in battle. He was his friend, the first person his age to exchange thoughts. He thought bitterly of Eli, who was simply throwing away the lives of Imperial soldiers for his own personal, utterly selfish and incomprehensible goals. These soldiers shouldn't have died after all. A normal squad wouldn't risk people's lives just to chase after some pathetic rebels. This was insane. Luca thought bitterly that even if Eli was lucky enough to come out to Lillian, she would still die. And how was he even going to help her in such a situation? He understood that Lillian was Eli's lover, but he didn't see why he should die with her, for his emotions had clearly taken complete control of him. Suddenly, a silver-haired rebel jumped out from behind cover, shouting that he was surrendering and that he was of the Ramones family, which caught Luca's attention. Luca coldly asked where Lillian Ramones was headed. He didn't care at all if this rebel surrendered or not. He was only interested in her. The captive whispered fearfully that he didn't know where the heiress had gone, his voice shaking with fear of the formidable Imperial warrior standing over him. Luca noticed the rebel's pupil twitch, a common sign of lying, and he realized the captive was trying to deceive him and hide the truth. Without saying a word, Luke grabbed the rebel, who screamed in terror, not realizing what was happening, because he had just surrendered voluntarily. Luca asked menacingly where Lillian Ramones had gone, giving the captive one last chance to tell the truth and perhaps thereby save his worthless life. The frightened rebel blurted out that she had gone downstairs, but Luca doubted it, for to escape one must go upstairs unless there was no other way of escape. Luca then asked if he had seen Elias Karfiku here, and the captive, stammering, confirmed that it was Elias who had brutalized him and his comrades in arms. The captive cried out in horror that Elias was mad, for they were buddies, but he did not spare them even when they had already surrendered completely to his mercy. Luca ruthlessly massacred his captive, his silhouette frozen above his defeated foe against a blood-red glow, symbolizing his determination. He coldly remarked that the one would have been executed anyway, and it was better to meet the end here than to be subjected to further brutal torture in the Imperial dungeons. Luca felt no guilt for the murder, but today he felt especially detached from everything that was happening, thinking that the battlefield had that effect on a person. He moved further down the tunnel, overgrown with some vegetation, and began to hear more clearly the screams and gunshots coming from somewhere in front. He had a heavy pistol in his hand, and he thought anxiously of Eli, who might already have passed the point of no return in his mad rush to save Lillian. Luca wondered what he should do if Eli had indeed crossed the line, and what he should do in this incredibly complicated and confusing situation. He was always overcome with paranoia when he was with Eli. He wondered so much about his true motives and intentions that it drove him crazy. What would he do if Eli went against the Empire? That question haunted him relentlessly, and the symbol of the Empire loomed ominously before his eyes. He had continually put off answering that question, but now there was nowhere to go, and he had to face this brutal truth head-on. Luca stepped forward with determination, surrounded by the corpses of defeated enemies, ready to face Elias and make the hardest decision of his life. Luca shouted Eli's name in despair as he saw him standing in the middle of the hall strewn with the bodies of slain Imperial soldiers, and the horrible truth was revealed to him. Eli turned around quietly, as if he had been expecting him to show up, and said with slight sadness that Luca had come after all, confirming his friend's worst fears. Luca accused Eli with disbelief and pain in his voice that he had indeed ruined his subordinates for some personal interest he did not understand. Eli's gaze swept over the group of people, including Vigo Ramones, the head of the family, his closest relatives, and, of course, Lillian herself, his beloved. Luca shouted at Eli in rage, unable to believe that he had done all this for one single bloody woman, betraying his comrades and his duty. Eli crossed his arms over his chest and replied understandingly that he would not let the incident get him down, recognizing his guilt and willingness to face the consequences of his actions. He looked at Luca defiantly and firmly demanded that he draw his sword, preparing for the inevitable and possibly the last duel between the two of them.